They never told you that medieval castles beneath their proud towers and stone walls reeked of waste, decay, and secrets no chronicle dared to name. Every room hid something stained, every hallway carried a shadow that history tried to wash away. What you think you know about noble life is only the polished surface of a world built on filth, fear, and the quiet endurance of those who lived inside it. Tonight, you will walk through those forgotten corridors and see what the stones have never confessed. So before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If someone were to stand before a medieval castle for the first time, the structure would likely appear calm and magnificent in a way that demanded quiet attention. The tall towers, rising above the fields, would seem untouched by anything ordinary, and the thick stone walls would hold the light of the early day, as if they were built for eternity. From a distance, the moat circling the base looked like a clean divide between common life and the world of privilege. The gates framed a view of order and authority, convincing anyone who approached that everything inside must reflect the same grandeur. The impression was so strong that it shaped people's beliefs long before they ever stepped through the entrance. To the medieval mind, castles symbolized wealth and power in their most direct form. Their size alone made them objects of admiration, reminders that the people living behind those walls existed above the struggles of the villagers outside. The stonework, the battlements, and the structured layout created an image of disciplined living, something far removed from the muddy roads and crowded huts beyond the walls. It is almost humorous to think that so many believed stone and height could magically keep discomfort away, as if prestige could disinfect reality. Yet this belief was widely accepted, strengthened by stories that glorified aristocratic life and ignored the grime beneath it. If we imagine this in a modern sense, it would be similar to assuming that any towering building with polished windows must offer perfect living conditions simply because it looks impressive from a distance. People tend to trust what appears orderly, even when they have never stepped inside to see what truly happens there. Medieval castles benefited from this instinct, gaining admiration not from their reality but from their outward form. The truth, however, was far less elegant than the silhouette they cast against the sky. The outer walls created an illusion that life inside must be structured, refined, and clean. But once one crossed the gateway, that expectation faded quickly. The courtyards were loud and cluttered with activity. Servants hurried with heavy loads, spreading dirt with every step. Horses walked across the same paths used by nobles, leaving behind what animals always leave behind. Fires burned constantly, filling the air with smoke that clung to clothing and walls. Inside the towers, the narrow staircases trapped moisture and stale air, creating a damp smell that lingered no matter how many tapestries were hung to disguise it. The contrast between assumption and reality was striking. Those who viewed the castle from afar imagined smooth routines, luxury, and comfort. But the people who lived inside moved through spaces affected by every inconvenience of medieval life. The stone walls that seemed so impressive from outside were cold and unyielding. They absorbed smoke, trapped odors, and echoed noise in ways that made daily living far from peaceful. I find it unsettling how quickly a grand exterior can persuade people to ignore the possibility of discomfort hidden right behind it. Despite this, the belief in the castle's magnificence persisted. Nobles wore fine clothing, but the fabric absorbed odors from smoke-filled halls. Feasts appeared elegant in paintings, yet the floors beneath the tables were often covered with layers of rushes meant to hide spills and waste, though those rushes eventually became sources of odor themselves. People outside the castle never saw these details. They saw only the ceremonies, the armor polished for display, the banners waving proudly, and they assumed the interior matched the spectacle. Architecture played a role in sustaining this illusion. The towers that looked graceful on the horizon were cramped and dark inside. Windows were narrow, letting in little air. Rooms could be drafty in winter and suffocating in summer. The thick walls that protected against arrows also trapped moisture, making certain chambers perpetually damp. From a distance, the castle seemed to promise stability and strength. Up close, it revealed the compromises required by medieval living, compromises no amount of stone could conceal. Visitors who entered for the first time often struggled to reconcile the difference between what they expected and what they experienced. The grand halls were impressive in size, but filled with smells from meals, fires, animals, and people. The passageways were narrow, the staircases steep, and the general atmosphere far from the calm elegance suggested by the castle's exterior. Even the quietest corners carried reminders that many lives intersected there each day, bringing noise, dirt, and wear to every surface. Still, the myth of cleanliness and luxury persisted because people wanted to believe in symbols. Castles represented protection, authority, and hierarchy. It was easier to attach purity and refinement to those symbols than to acknowledge the reality of crowded rooms, smoke-filled halls, and the constant presence of animals. The outside remained a powerful story, one that overshadowed anything contradictory within the walls. Over time, this image became fixed in collective memory. Stories, paintings, and later romanticized histories all contributed to the illusion that the lives of nobles were defined by elegance. But the stones themselves kept the truth. They absorbed everything that happened inside: smoke, dirt, footsteps, spilled food, and the endless activity required to maintain life in a structure that was always busier and messier than its outer appearance suggested. The castle, then, was a contradiction grand enough to inspire admiration, yet ordinary enough inside to remind anyone who lived there that prestige did not erase discomfort. It stood tall and proud on the landscape, shaping the way people imagined power. But stepping inside revealed something else entirely, something closer to real medieval life than the stories that survived. The image of grandeur fades quickly once the first layer of stone is crossed. Deeper inside those walls, the distance between appearance and truth grows wider with every step, and behind one quiet doorway lies the first hint of what the castle truly tried to keep hidden. Life inside the residential quarters of a medieval castle was far less spacious and refined than its impressive exterior suggested. Rooms that looked sturdy from the outside were often cramped and dim, holding more people than they were ever meant to accommodate. Families, servants, and sometimes visiting workers shared the same floors, their belongings scattered around in ways that made separation of space nearly impossible. The cold stone walls provided safety from invasion, but they offered no comfort against the lack of privacy or the closeness of daily living. People slept wherever there was room, forming tight clusters on thin bedding that did little to soften the hardness of the floor beneath them. Straw cloth and old blankets were arranged to create makeshift sleeping areas, though these materials rarely stayed clean for long. Dirt from shoes, ash from fires, and moisture from damp clothing settled onto everything. The shared sleeping space made it easy for insects to move from one person to another. Fleas and lice thrived in these conditions, hiding themselves in fabric folds, hair, and the straw bedding that was rarely replaced. It is almost absurd that such crowded rooms were once imagined as places of graceful living, as if social status could somehow repel filth. In reality, the closeness of bodies and the lack of sanitation created an environment where discomfort was a basic part of life. The presence of animals added another layer to the already crowded atmosphere. Cats and dogs wandered through the rooms, sometimes curling up next to sleeping people for warmth. Rodents, drawn by leftover food and a constant supply of hiding places, scurried freely across floors and into corners. Storage areas, bedding, and piles of belongings provided ideal conditions for rats whose waste mixed with dust and straw. Their movement was so common that many residents barely reacted when they heard scratching in the darkness. The castle did not separate human spaces from animal spaces in the way we expect today, and the result was a daily merging of living conditions that blurred any line between cleanliness and survival. Because hygiene practices were limited, the rooms never truly smelled clean. Bathing was infrequent, water was scarce, and personal cleanliness was often a low priority compared to basic survival tasks. People wiped sweat with cloths, reused multiple times, changed clothing infrequently, and went to sleep without washing off the day's dirt. The air inside the sleeping quarters carried a mix of odors from unwashed bodies, damp fabric smoke that settled into every surface, and waste that was not always removed promptly. This was not considered unusual at the time. It was simply the expected reality of living within heavy stone walls that trapped everything inside. Crowdedness also made illness spread quickly. When one person fell sick, others sharing the same floor inevitably caught it as well. Respiratory issues, skin infections, and fevers circulated endlessly, especially during colder months, when windows remained shut and fires burned constantly. The mixture of smoke and stale air formed a heavy atmosphere that many residents accepted as normal. If we imagine this by today's standards, it would be like placing an entire household, children, adults, workers, and animals, into a single unventilated room, and expecting health to thrive despite the conditions. The contrast between expectation and reality was stark, yet people continued living this way, simply because there were no alternatives. Servants experienced the most difficulty, as their sleeping spaces were often the most crowded of all. They slept near storage areas, stairwells, or close to kitchens, so they could begin working before dawn. Their bedding was thinner and replaced even less often, collecting grime at a faster rate. They also remained constantly exposed to the refuse-spilled food and waste that accumulated throughout the day. Servants carried the weight of running the castle, yet their living quarters were among the least considered spaces within the structure. Their daily lives reflected the imbalance between the castle's grand reputation and the harsh conditions that supported it. Families of the household fared only slightly better. While they might have had dedicated chambers, these rooms were still shared among several people. Children rarely had separate spaces, and guests sometimes slept on the same floors as permanent residents. The layering of straw did little to conceal the dirt beneath, and even noble families encountered the same insects, rodents, and odors as their servants. The idea of personal space did not match modern expectations. Privacy was limited, and personal belongings were constantly within reach of others. The lack of sanitation practices meant that waste built up quickly. Food scraps left on plates attracted pests, and spilled drink seeped into the rush mats that were not cleaned regularly. Laundry was difficult, requiring water that had to be carried manually, and soap that was expensive or unavailable. Clothing absorbed sweat, smoke, and dust, slowly becoming stiff and musty. The presence of so many people in such a confined area intensified every scent, sound, and physical discomfort. Despite all this, daily life continued with a sense of acceptance. People adapted to the closeness, the lack of ventilation, and the constant presence of pests. Their expectations were shaped by the world around them, not by any ideal of cleanliness or comfort. The castle provided shelter, and that alone was considered fortunate, even if it came with challenges that would feel overwhelming by modern standards. I find it difficult to imagine how easily people accepted these conditions, treating the mixture of dirt, insects, and shared bodies as an ordinary part of existence. Historical records often highlight the beauty of castle architecture, yet those same walls enclose spaces that were anything but elegant. The living conditions reveal a more grounded truth. No amount of status or wealth could completely overcome the limitations of medieval hygiene. Behind the decorated halls and ceremonial gatherings, the private spaces where people slept and lived were filled with the realities of a world that lacked sanitation, privacy, and fresh air. These rooms stand as reminders that history is often shaped by what is seen, not by what is lived. The grandeur of the exterior overshadowed the daily discomfort hidden inside, forming a lasting myth that continues to color our understanding of medieval life. The truth is far more human, messy, crowded, and shaped by circumstances that left little room for the luxuries we now take for granted. The closeness of daily life reveals far more than the castle's outer walls ever suggested. Beyond those crowded rooms, the realities of survival begin to distort the image of nobility. And somewhere in the dim spaces ahead lies the first sign of how deeply neglect shaped the castle's routines. Beneath the bright fabrics worn by the nobility, daily life in a medieval castle carried a heaviness that clothing could never truly hide. The long gowns layered with rich colors and expensive trims suggested refinement and discipline. Yet those same garments absorbed every odor of the environment. People wore their clothing for extended periods, sometimes weeks without washing it. Water was scarce, soap was costly, and laundering. Heavy fabrics required labor that few were willing to spare. The elegant appearance of the garments created an illusion of purity, but the air surrounding them told a different story entirely. The layers of cloth trapped sweat, and the smell of smoke from the hearth fires that burned constantly throughout the castle. Perfumes were used generously, not to add beauty, but to mask what clung to the skin. These scents, strong and sweet, mingled with the natural odors of unwashed bodies, creating a combination that was heavy rather than pleasant. It is almost ironic that the more elaborate the clothing became, the more it was used to conceal rather than to express status. People wore these garments proudly, unaware of how the reality beneath them contradicted the image they presented. Bathing was rare, often avoided out of fear or inconvenience. Instead of washing, many wiped their skin with damp cloths or scented liquids, leaving behind layers of residue rather than removing dirt. This residue, mixed with sweat oils and dust, forming a texture that clung to the body under several layers of fabric. The skin beneath the clothing was rarely exposed to fresh air, and the build-up of sweat and grime became a normal part of daily existence. In crowded rooms with poor ventilation, these odors intensified, creating a background atmosphere that never fully disappeared. Clothing also accumulated the small details of daily living: ashes from the fireplace, traces of food from meals, and dust from the stone floors. Long skirts dragged across surfaces that were rarely cleaned thoroughly, picking up whatever lay beneath them. Sleeves brushed against rush mats where animals sometimes slept. Capes absorbed dampness from hallways that trapped moisture. People moved through these spaces with confidence, unaware of how their garments recorded the environment as faithfully as any written account could. While modern expectations associate hygiene with routine maintenance, medieval standards were built around practicality. Water for washing had to be heated manually, and soap was considered a luxury. Servants were responsible for cleaning clothing, yet they managed endless tasks with limited time, so washing was reserved for visible stains rather than for odor or hygiene. If we compare this approach to today's habits, it would resemble wearing the same outfit for weeks while relying entirely on perfume to create the impression of cleanliness. The contrast highlights how different expectations shaped what people accepted as normal. Perfume was used in quantities that would feel overwhelming now. It was applied not only to the skin but also to clothing, hair, and accessories. The stronger the scent, the more effectively it masked the odors beneath, or so people believed. The result was a layered smell of sweat, dirt, and overpowering fragrance. These mixtures became a signature of life in noble settings, misleading those who assumed that the presence of strong scents meant the presence of hygiene. The garments themselves often irritated. Fabrics were heavy, and the underlayers scratched the skin when worn for long periods. Sweat trapped beneath the layers led to rashes and infections that could not heal properly without fresh air. People tolerated these discomforts because the clothing represented social rank. To remove a gown or robe for cleaning meant losing the appearance of status, even temporarily. As a result, many chose to endure discomfort rather than let their image slip. The idea that wealth automatically meant cleanliness was reinforced by distance. Those outside the castle rarely saw the nobles up close. They saw only the garments from afar, flowing gracefully in ceremonies or gatherings. The smell, the residue, and the discomfort were invisible from a distance, hidden behind silk and brocade. This separation strengthened the myth that the noble lifestyle was elegant. But daily living inside the castle walls showed that elegance was only a surface, not a truth. The deeper contradiction lay in how people viewed these garments. They admired the intricate patterns, the rich dyes, and the craftsmanship, without realizing that these same fabrics trapped everything the castle environment produced. Clothing became a barrier between the person and the world, yet it failed to prevent the merging of odors, dirt, and discomfort. The symbols of prestige did not protect the wearer from the realities of life. They simply concealed them from view. Even in private spaces, the conditions did not improve. Clothes hung on pegs in rooms filled with smoke from nearby fires, absorbing it the moment it drifted through the air. Fabrics dried slowly in damp chambers, often retaining a musty scent. Servants brushed the garments, but brushing did little to remove the deeper grime. These layers built up over time, turning clothing into a record of weeks of accumulated odors and traces of daily living. Yet despite all this, people carried themselves with confidence. They believed in the message their garments conveyed, not in the reality they experienced. I find it remarkable how strongly appearance influenced their understanding of cleanliness, even when the daily discomfort could not be ignored. Clothing became a symbol of aspiration, and for many, that symbol was more important than the truth beneath it. The rich fabrics reveal far more about daily life than the polished surface of ceremony ever allowed. Behind each layer, the struggle to hide discomfort becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Somewhere beyond those familiar routines lies another truth that disguises itself beneath habit and neglect. Human waste management inside a medieval castle was one of the clearest reminders that prestige did not guarantee cleanliness. The absence of modern toilets shaped daily routines in ways that were both uncomfortable and unavoidable. Most castles relied on garderobes, narrow stone chambers, built into the walls where a simple wooden seat was placed over an opening. Through this opening, waste dropped directly down the exterior wall or into a ditch courtyard or moat. The design served its purpose, but it did little to protect the building from the persistent smell or the risks that came with such proximity to human waste. The openness of the system left no room for privacy, and the odor clinging to the surrounding areas was impossible to ignore. Garderobes varied in size and placement, yet none offered true sanitation. Waste accumulated where it fell, forming piles that needed to be removed by hand. Servants were responsible for scraping out these heaps, placing the waste into buckets or carts, and dumping it far enough away that it would not interfere with daily castle life. The task demanded physical strength and tolerance for conditions most people would refuse today. It is almost darkly humorous that such an essential chore was handled with nothing more than a bucket and bare hands, as if necessity alone could compensate for the lack of tools. Gloves were rare, water was limited, and the work left stains and odours that were difficult to wash off. Despite the discomfort, the system was considered normal. People accepted the smell as part of the castle environment, just as they accepted smoke-filled rooms or crowded sleeping spaces. Waste was not hidden. It was simply placed where it was easiest to discard. Some garderobes emptied into moats, which quickly became stagnant pools of sewage. The smell rising from them was a constant presence, drifting upward to windows and doorways. Over time, waste layered upon itself, forming thick deposits that blended with mud and debris. Servants who cleaned these areas had to climb down into ditches or lean out from walkways, balancing their bodies over steep drops to reach the accumulated mass. Other castles used chamber pots, especially during nighttime or harsh weather. These pots were left in the corners of sleeping rooms or hallways until servants collected them in the morning. The mixture of urine, feces, and water sat exposed for hours, slowly releasing odour into confined spaces that already struggled with ventilation. In winter, the cold stiffened the waste, but the smell remained. In warmer seasons, flies gathered around the pots, landing on walls, clothing, and food. If we compare this practice to modern sanitation, it resembles leaving household trash uncollected for days inside a sealed room and expecting it not to affect daily living. The expectation of cleanliness simply did not exist in the same way it does now. Servants bore the heaviest burden. They carried chamber pots through narrow passageways, splashing their contents onto their clothing and skin as they navigated stairs and crowded halls. Waste disposal required handling filth directly, often without access to clean water afterward. Many worked with cuts on their hands or untreated skin conditions, increasing the risk of infection. Yet their labour was rarely acknowledged. Their work kept the castle functional, but they remained invisible in the social hierarchy. When illness spread, they were often blamed, even though the conditions they endured were created by the entire household. The location of the garderobes also introduced structural challenges. Waste dripping down the outer walls attracted insects and rodents. The moisture weakened certain sections of stone, requiring repairs that were costly and time-consuming. The walls stained over time, darkening in streaks that reflected years of accumulated waste. Residents grew accustomed to these marks, treating them as part of the castle's natural aging rather than signs of poor sanitation. These stains, mixed with rainwater and debris, created areas where mold and bacteria thrived. Inside the castle, the smell of waste lingered even in rooms far from the garderobes. Airflow was limited, and smoke from fires mixed with the odour to create a heavy atmosphere that was always present even if overlooked. Because people had little understanding of sanitation or disease, they did not associate their environment with health risks. Illness was attributed to fate, divine punishment, or the seasons, rather than the unsanitary conditions surrounding them. I find it unsettling how easily necessity shaped acceptance, turning an unpleasant reality into something that no longer caused alarm. The system persisted for centuries because it required minimal effort to maintain. Building advanced plumbing was impossible with available technology, and the lack of understanding about hygiene left people without a reason to consider alternatives. Castles were designed for defense, not comfort, and every structural choice reflected that priority. Waste disposal was simply one more part of daily life that had to be endured regardless of unpleasantness or long-term consequences. Even today, archaeological digs reveal the remnants of these systems. Layers of compacted waste, preserved in cold or dry environments, provide insight into what people ate and how they lived. The deposits often contain parasites, seeds, and traces of illness. These findings serve as quiet reminders that life inside a castle, despite its grandeur, was marked by physical realities that modern sensibilities find difficult to imagine. The management of waste exposes more about castle life than any grand hall or ceremony ever could. Within those stone walls, necessity overwhelmed dignity in ways that reshape our understanding of nobility. Hidden beneath daily routines lies another aspect of survival that reveals how fragile comfort truly was. Sleeping quarters inside a medieval castle were shaped less by comfort and more by practicality. and this practicality carried consequences that lingered in the air. Straw mattresses lay directly on the cold floors, flattened by repeated use and rarely replaced. Over time, the straw broke apart, releasing dust and fibers that mixed with dirt from shoes and ash from nearby fires. These mattresses absorbed everything: sweat, moisture, and the smell of unwashed bodies. And once the scent settled in, it became a permanent part of the room. Changing the straw required labor, and servants often prioritized more urgent tasks, leaving the bedding to deteriorate slowly until it became little more than a mound of worn debris. People did not sleep alone. Families shared the same spaces, and servants often rested only a few feet away. Children lay beside adults, and visitors slept wherever a patch of floor remained free. In the dim light of the chambers, the shapes of people and animals blended throughout the night. Cats curled near warm bodies, dogs rested at the feet of their owners, and small rodents slipped into the bedding in search of heat or food scraps. It is almost grimly comical that such crowded quarters were expected to provide rest, as though exhaustion alone could make discomfort disappear. The shared breathing, the shifting bodies, and the constant noise created an atmosphere far from peaceful. The mattresses carried more than just the remnants of daily living. Sweat soaked into the fabric layers, leaving dark patches that hardened over time. During warmer seasons, the heat intensified every odor, merging them into a thick scent that clung to clothing and hair. People also relieved themselves during the night, if rising to use a chamber pot was too inconvenient, causing urine to seep into the straw and remain there indefinitely. Menstrual blood stained the bedding as well, absorbed into the cloth that was rarely washed thoroughly. The combination created a layered smell that was difficult to ignore, one that lingered long after the room fell silent. Ventilation in these chambers was poor. Windows were small, often shuttered against cold weather or unwanted intruders. Fires kept the air warm, but also filled the rooms with smoke, adding heaviness to the already dense atmosphere. The air felt stale even in the middle of the day, holding the scent of the previous night, long after people had woken and dispersed. Dust floated visibly in the shafts of light, entering through narrow openings, settling again on bedding and clothing. Breathing in such conditions became a task in itself, especially for those with weakened health. Because washing was infrequent, the fabrics used for bedding accumulated grime from every season. Sheets, when they existed, were cleaned only on rare occasions. Washing required heated water, soap, and labor resources that households saved for more essential tasks. As a result, the same sheets were used for weeks or months, becoming stiff from dried sweat and brittle from constant exposure to smoke. If we imagine this through modern expectations, it would resemble sleeping every night on a damp and unwashed camping mat shared by an entire group of people with no option for fresh bedding. The comparison highlights how limited comfort truly was within the castle walls. Animals contributed their own marks to the environment. Cats hunted rodents during the night, leaving behind small traces of their catches. Dogs, restless and alert to noises outside, moved between sleeping people, shaking dirt onto the bedding. Livestock are sometimes sheltered indoors during severe weather, bringing in mud and odors from the courtyard. The boundary between human and animal space barely existed, and nighttime brought all living creatures together in ways that amplified every scent and sound. Illness grew easily in such conditions. Skin infections, rashes, and respiratory issues spread quickly among those who shared the same mattress or slept close to one another. The combination of sweat, damp straw, and smoke created an environment where bacteria could thrive. People often awoke with sore throats or irritated eyes, conditions they accepted as the usual discomforts of living in a castle. I find it striking how the need for shelter overshadowed any desire for hygiene, as though survival alone excused every unpleasant reality. Rest was necessary, but true rest was difficult to achieve in such confined and unsanitary spaces. The scent of the sleeping quarters did not stay within the chambers. It followed people throughout the day. Their clothing absorbed the smells of the night, carrying them into hallways, kitchens, and gathering rooms. Servants were most affected as they moved constantly, spreading the odors to every corner of the castle. The lack of fresh air and the constant presence of smoke intensified this effect, giving the entire living area a uniform scent that none could escape. Nobles, despite their elegant clothing and attempts at fragrance, could not fully separate themselves from the reality of their sleeping environments. The idea of comfort within a medieval castle is often shaped by images of grand halls and tapestries, yet the place where people spent a third of their lives told a far different story. The sleeping quarters, with their crowded spaces, decaying bedding, and persistent odors reflected a daily struggle against conditions that offered little sense of relief. These rooms were not sanctuaries but practical spaces, shaped entirely by necessity and the limitations of the time. The contrast between the castle's exterior grandeur and the realities of its interior sleeping arrangements reveals a truth that often goes unmentioned. The comfort was a privilege few truly experienced. Most people rested out of exhaustion rather than ease, accepting discomfort as part of their existence. Their nights were filled with smells, sounds, and proximity that modern sensibilities would find overwhelming, yet they endured it without question. The scent of nightly life reveals more about these living spaces than any record of ceremony or tradition. Within those crowded rooms, the struggle to rest becomes another reminder of how far reality diverged from appearance. Somewhere deeper in the castle's routines lies a truth shaped not by grandeur but by the quiet accumulation of neglect. Floors inside a medieval castle were rarely made of smooth stone or clean wood. Instead, many rooms were covered with layers of straw and decaying plant material that acted as a crude solution for absorbing spills, waste, and daily dirt. This mixture scattered unevenly across the ground, softened footsteps and provided insulation, but it also trapped every substance that fell upon it. Over time, the straw darkened, mashed into a damp layer, as water, food scraps, and human waste seeped into it. What was meant to simplify cleaning became, in practice, a surface that recorded every unpleasant detail of life inside the castle. Fresh straw was seldom added. Replacing it required effort, time, and labor that servants often could not spare. Instead, new layers were scattered on top of old ones, burying what lay beneath without truly removing it. The deeper layers decomposed slowly, releasing a musty scent that filled the rooms even when no one was present. It is almost bleakly amusing that people believed piling new straw over rotting material made the space cleaner, as though covering decay could somehow erase it. Each step pressed the old straw into the floor, compacting it into a sponge that held moisture and filth long after the source had vanished. The straw served as an improvised cleaning tool, absorbing spills from mealtimes, soot drifting from fireplaces, and the remnants of animals that wandered through the castle. It was common to find feathers, bits of bone, crushed insects, and droppings mixed into the floor covering. Rodents used the straw as nesting material, burrowing into it, and leaving behind trails of waste that remained unnoticed until the smell intensified. People walking across the room kicked up small clouds of dust and particles that drifted through the air before settling on furniture, clothing, and food. Moisture was one of the biggest problems. Because ventilation was limited, the straw rarely dried completely. Rainwater, tracked in from the courtyard, and spills from washing basins soaked into the ground, turning patches of the floor into damp, cold areas that never truly dried. The moisture encouraged the growth of mold, which clung to the straw and walls in pale clusters. If we compare this to a modern environment, it would resemble living on a carpet that had not been cleaned for years, where every spill and stain simply accumulated into a damp and decaying mass. The smell alone would be enough to overwhelm anyone accustomed to contemporary standards of sanitation. The constant moisture also encouraged bacteria and other microorganisms to multiply. People of the time had little understanding of these risks, so they accepted the musty smell as normal. They did not associate illness with the floor beneath their feet, viewing discomfort and disease as part of life, rather than a preventable consequence. Children played on the floors, servants knelt on them to prepare food or scrub laundry, and animals slept wherever they could find warmth. The straw that softened footsteps also softened the boundaries between cleanliness and contamination. In winter, the dampness became even more noticeable. The cold air lowered the temperature inside the castle, making the moist straw cling more tightly to the stone underneath. Fires dried the upper layers slightly, but added soot that settled into every corner. People spent more time indoors during harsh weather, increasing the amount of food waste, dirt, and bodily fluids that accumulated on the floor. The more time people spent inside, the worse the conditions became, creating a cycle that made fresh air and cleanliness seem like distant luxuries. Servants faced the harshest impact of this environment. Much of their work required kneeling on the straw-covered floors, exposing them directly to the dampness and debris embedded within it. Their hands and clothing absorbed the smell which followed them throughout the day. Cleaning was nearly impossible. Removing the straw meant lifting layers that stuck together, held by moisture and rot. The weight of this decomposed mass, combined with the presence of insects and rodents, made the task physically demanding and unpleasant. Yet without these periodic cleanings, the living conditions would deteriorate even further. Nobles did not escape these realities. Although they spent time in decorated rooms and wore fine clothing, they still walked across the same straw, inhaled the same musty air, and lived in spaces affected by the same moisture and decay. Their tapestries and cushions trapped the same odors that spread from the floors, making the entire castle share a single underlying scent. Even ceremonial halls, cleaned more often than other rooms, could not fully escape the effects of the floor covering that lay beneath. No amount of decoration could mask the smell for long. The straw carried the story of everything that had passed through the room: shoes caked with mud, spilled wine, fallen ashes, and waste from the animals that wandered freely inside. The castle was not an untouched symbol of elegance, but a lived-in space shaped by necessity. Comfort was secondary. Cleanliness was an afterthought. And the floors, meant to protect people from cold stone, ended up becoming one of the strongest reminders of how little control anyone had over their environment. This system continued for generations because there was no better alternative. People accepted the smell, the dampness, and the discomfort as part of daily living. The straw softened their steps, but also blurred the distinction between safety and filth. It offered a fragile layer between the people and the world beneath their feet, one that changed slowly and silently until the line between cleanliness and decay nearly vanished. The floor beneath them revealed more truth than any polished surface ever could. With every step, the hidden layers of daily life pressed further into the ground, shaping the air they breathed. In the quiet depth of that decay waited another reminder of how deeply the castle depended on neglect to function. Parasites thrived inside medieval castles in ways that reflected the close quarters and limited hygiene of the time. Lice, fleas, and other small insects settled easily into clothing, bedding, and the everyday belongings of those who lived there. The heavy garments worn by nobles, layered and rarely washed, created ideal hiding places for these creatures. The inner seams of hats and the folds of cloaks provided warmth and darkness, allowing insects to multiply unnoticed. People carried them from room to room without realizing how quickly they spread. The constant movement of bodies, animals, and fabric made it nearly impossible to maintain a space free of infestation. Helmets and armor worn frequently during training or travel offered even better shelter for lice. The padding inside helmets absorbed sweat and oils from the scalp, creating a moist environment where eggs could cling securely. Soldiers and guards who wore their gear for long hours found themselves hosting entire colonies of insects without immediate awareness. It is almost darkly amusing that objects meant to symbolize strength and protection doubled as some of the most comfortable homes for parasites. Removing the armor at the end of the day often revealed itching redness and small bites that were simply accepted as part of daily life. Combs designed specifically for removing lice became valuable tools within noble households. These fine-toothed instruments were made of wood, bone, or metal, and they served one purpose: to pull insects and their eggs from hair. Servants used them carefully each morning, running the combs through the hair of their employers to catch any parasites before they multiplied further. The process was time-consuming and uncomfortable, but it remained one of the few effective methods available. If we imagine this routine in modern terms, it resembles beginning each day with a mandatory inspection for pests, acknowledging that infestation was not a possibility, but an expectation. The daily ritual served as both grooming and maintenance of the fragile illusion of nobility. Hair care itself was shaped by the constant presence of insects. Long hair, though fashionable, trapped sweat and provided additional space for lice to attach their eggs. Washing hair was rare, and scented oils were used more often to mask smell than to improve hygiene. These oils, while pleasant, attracted dust and debris, creating a coating that made the scalp even more inviting for insects. Servants spent significant time examining hair strand by strand, trying to manage outbreaks before they grew overwhelming. Despite their effort, few households were ever truly free of parasites. Beds and bedding were equally infested. Straw mattresses, already damp and decaying, housed fleas that moved easily between animals and people. Each night, those who slept on the bedding became food sources, waking with bites on their arms, legs, and necks. The cold stone walls did nothing to deter insects, and the warmth of bodies lying close together made the sleeping quarters a thriving environment for reproduction. People scratched throughout the night, leaving small marks on their skin that sometimes grew infected. The irritation became a constant background to daily living. Clothing further complicated matters. Layers of fabric held insects tightly, allowing them to survive even when garments were hung away from the body. Capes, robes, and even decorative elements, such as fur trims, concealed both adult insects and their eggs. Nobles attending gatherings carried their infestations into crowded spaces where contact between garments caused unintentional exchanges. Servants faced the worst exposure, handling laundry and bedding with their bare hands, often becoming hosts themselves long before the nobles noticed any signs. Animals added to the problem. Dogs and cats, though helpful in controlling rodents, brought their own fleas into the living quarters. These insects transferred easily from fur to fabric, spreading through the castle with little resistance. The presence of animals indoors during harsh seasons intensified the situation. Their bedding mixed with human bedding, turning the entire room into a shared habitat for pests. People treated these conditions as normal. Itching was expected, bites were ignored, and the sight of insects was rarely met with alarm. Without knowledge of disease, transmission, or sanitation, infestations were viewed as inconveniences rather than health hazards. Parasites reflected the limitations of the environment more than personal failure. Even the wealthiest residents dressed in expensive fabrics carried lice beneath their collars and in the folds of their sleeves. Attempts to control infestations were inconsistent. Some households boiled combs or used herbal mixtures on hair, but these solutions offered only temporary relief. Insects returned, quickly drawn to the same warm spaces that had sheltered them before. The architecture of the castle itself supported their survival. Narrow hallways, thick fabrics, and limited ventilation kept the environment stable enough for insects to thrive without interruption. The persistence of parasites revealed an overlooked truth about castle life. Privilege did not shield anyone from discomfort. Wealth provided clothing, servants, and ceremony, but it could not offer protection from the microscopic inhabitants that shared the same environment. The parasites became witnesses to daily routines, feeding on the people who maintained the structure of society. I find it unsettling how silently these creatures shaped the experience of living in a place remembered for its power and prestige. Their presence undermines the romantic images, often associated with medieval nobility, revealing a world where discomfort lived beneath every garment. In the end, the insects were not mere nuisances, but constant reminders of the shared vulnerability inside the castle walls. Their persistence showed that even the strongest defenses could not protect against the realities of close quarters, limited hygiene, and the dense rhythm of medieval life. The presence of these tiny creatures revealed more about daily existence than any polished garment ever could. Within those crowded chambers, discomfort settled into every corner and every seam of clothing. Deep beyond the routines of daily living waited another truth about how survival shaped every experience inside the castle. Food within a medieval castle carried a reputation for abundance, yet the conditions under which it was prepared revealed a reality far removed from refinement. Kitchens were busy, crowded spaces, where heat from multiple fires filled the air with smoke and the smell of burning fat. The rush of activity left little time for careful cleaning, and those who worked there rarely washed their hands. Servants moved quickly between tasks, handling raw meat, dough, and utensils, without pausing to remove the residue that clung to their skin. It is almost bleakly amusing that feasts meant to display wealth and sophistication began with hands that had not touched clean water all day. The pace of work simply did not allow for modern expectations of hygiene. Food preparation surfaces were improvised rather than sanitized. Wooden tables, darkened by years of use, absorbed juices and oils from every meal prepared on them. These surfaces were scraped occasionally with knives, but true cleaning was infrequent. Cracks in the wood trapped remnants of past meals, forming layers of grease and crumbs that never fully disappeared. Servants kneaded dough, chopped vegetables, and butchered animals on the same boards, often in quick succession. The wood held the smell of each task, blending them into a scent that stayed in the kitchen long after the fires cooled. Flies hovered constantly over the food. Drawn by the warmth, moisture, and aroma of cooking meat, they gathered in swarms that servants could not hope to control. They landed on bowls, utensils, and surfaces, leaving behind invisible traces that no one understood as harmful. People accepted the presence of flies as part of daily living, swatting them away when convenient, but rarely making efforts to eliminate them. If we compare this to modern standards, it would resemble preparing an entire banquet in a room, without screens, relying on speed rather than cleanliness to keep pests away. The difference in expectation reveals how deeply the environment shaped ideas about what qualified as safe. Oil and animal fat spilled frequently onto the floor, Servants carrying heavy pots sometimes slipped, causing splashes that coated nearby surfaces. The stone floors grew slick and dark with residue, making them difficult to navigate. Water used for boiling and washing was emptied into channels that flowed near the cooking area, mixing with spilled liquids and scraps of food. These small streams attracted insects and sometimes rodents, creating a constant source of contamination. With limited tools and little time, servants did what they could to maintain order, but true cleanliness remained out of reach. Near the kitchen, waste piled quickly. Bones, vegetable scraps, and fish skins accumulated in buckets or corners until someone had time to carry them away. The smell of decomposition began within hours, blending with smoke and steam to create an atmosphere that clung to clothing and hair. Servants working long shifts found themselves surrounded by this combination of odors, unable to escape it even when they moved into other parts of the castle. Nobles dining in decorated halls rarely considered how the meals came to their plates, unaware that the scent of their kitchen lingered in the garments of those who served them. Meals were transported from the kitchen to the hall on wooden trays or in the hands of servants, who often brushed against animals or unclean surfaces along the way. Dogs followed them eagerly, hoping for scraps sometimes, licking the sides of serving boards before anyone noticed. Cats wandered freely, stepping onto preparation areas as they hunted for small pieces of meat. No barriers existed between animals and food, making contamination a constant but unnoticed element of castle dining. The final presentation of the food concealed these realities. Plates were arranged with care, meats were roasted to a shine, and bread was served warm. Candles lit the tables, softening the atmosphere and masking imperfections. Those who attended the feast enjoyed the appearance of abundance without questioning the environment that produced it. Servants stood nearby, their hands bearing the traces of the work they had done earlier that day. Nobles focused on taste and ceremony rather than the process behind each dish. Despite its outward appearance, castle dining reflected an unspoken acceptance of filth. People judged food by its flavor, not by the conditions of its preparation. They lacked the knowledge to connect hygiene with illness, attributing stomach pains or fevers to chance or divine will rather than to contamination. Illness passed quietly through households, leaving people puzzled rather than alarmed. Without understanding risk, they continued eating food prepared in ways that would now be considered hazardous. The kitchen, like many other parts of the castle, revealed the gap between image and reality. Grand feasts symbolized wealth, yet the environment that produced them was shaped by limitations and necessity. Servants worked tirelessly managing tasks that demanded strength and endurance more than precision. Their environment left marks on the food that could not be removed by presentation alone. The meals that reached the Great Hall carried far more of the kitchen than most diners ever realized. Behind each polished dish lay a labor shaped by speed, improvisation, and endless contact with the unclean. Far beyond the glow of the dining hall waited another truth about how nourishment intertwined with the harsh conditions of castle life. Animals were an inseparable part of daily life inside a medieval castle, moving freely through halls, courtyards, and sleeping quarters in ways that reflected the constant blending of human and animal worlds. Dogs wandered in and out of rooms following their owners, during hunts or lingering near the kitchen in search of scraps. Cats roamed the corridors, hunting mice that hid in storerooms and beneath staircases. Horses occupied spaces near the inner walls, close enough for convenience, their sounds echoing through the stone passages. On some days, even chickens or pigs found their way indoors, were brought inside temporarily, or were left to wander during harsh weather. The castle functioned as a shared habitat, where boundaries between species hardly existed. The presence of so many animals brought unavoidable consequences. Droppings accumulated in corners, hallways, and even near doorways, often stepped on before anyone noticed. Servants worked constantly to remove the waste, but the sheer volume of animals made the task endless. The smell settled into the stone, mixing with the scent of straw smoke and dampness already filling the interior. It is almost grimly humorous that noble households remembered for elegance and ceremony spent their days navigating the byproducts of the very creatures they depended on. The reality was far removed from the sanitized images often associated with medieval nobility. Animals provided essential functions that made their constant presence unavoidable. Dogs protected against intruders, guarded livestock, and served as hunting companions. Cats kept the rodent population under control, which was critical in a structure filled with food stores and wooden beams. Horses were indispensable for travel, and their proximity allowed rapid departure in times of danger. Pigs and chickens are offered food and waste disposal, consuming scraps that might otherwise rot in corridors. Each species played a role, and maintaining separation between them and humans would have been both impractical and contrary to the rhythm of castle life. The mix of animals and people shaped the castle's environment in profound ways. Floors were often damp from spilled water, mud from hooves, and the droppings of animals moving through narrow spaces. Servants used straw to cover the mess, but the straw itself trapped moisture and decay. The sound of hooves or paws became part of the daily background, echoing through long stone corridors. Feathers drifted from birds as they flapped through open courtyards, or perched in rafters settling onto furniture and clothing without notice. Inside bedrooms, animals sometimes slept in corners drawn by warmth. Dogs rested near hearths, their bodies adding heat to the chilly rooms. Cats curled on blankets or straw piles, accepted as necessary companions because they helped control pests. Even livestock occasionally spent nights indoors during storms or attacks, and their presence left powerful scents that lingered for days. If we imagine a modern equivalent, it would resemble living in a house where pets, farm animals, and working creatures share every room with little effort made to separate their habits from human routines. The idea may seem chaotic now, but for castle residents, it was simply life. Smells became normalized quickly. A mixture of manure, sweat, hay, and wet fur drifted through the air, clinging to clothing and furniture. Ventilation was limited, and windows were small, keeping the odors trapped inside the rooms. For newcomers, the scent might have been overwhelming, but those who lived there no longer noticed it after long exposure. Their senses adapted, and what might seem intolerable today became a familiar part of their environment. Animals also influenced social interactions. Dogs followed nobles into great halls, lying beneath tables during meals. Horses stood ready in inner courtyards while nobles prepared for travel. Chickens wandered near kitchens, pecking at grain or crumbs dropped in the rush of meal preparation. These creatures filled the castle with movement, sound, and constant evidence of shared living space. Their presence shaped the daily rhythm, marking moments with barks, footsteps, and low grunts that echoed against stone. Servants carried the burden of maintaining some semblance of cleanliness. They swept floors, removed waste, and washed garments soiled by animal contact. Their work never ended as new messes appeared within minutes of old ones being cleared. Exposure to foul odors became part of their identity, distinguishing them from nobles who spent more time in larger halls or on outdoor activities. Yet, even nobles were not spared the realities of animals in confined spaces, for they walked the same corridors and breathed the same air. Beyond practical roles, animals also shaped the emotional landscape of castle life. Dogs provided comfort and companionship, especially during long winters or times of uncertainty. Cats offered a sense of quiet presence, their movements creating small, comforting rhythms at night. Horses and livestock embodied stability, representing the resources that sustained the castle's economy. In this way, animals were not only functional, but deeply woven into the emotional fabric of daily living. Despite the closeness, the impact on hygiene remained unmistakable. Insects thrived in animal bedding. Rodents followed after food scraps and waste accumulated in ways impossible to fully control. Disease spread easily in such environments, though people lacked the knowledge to identify the source. Instead, they viewed illness as fate or divine judgment, unaware of how deeply their shared living space contributed to their suffering. The coexistence of humans and animals created a reality that was both practical and uncomfortable. The castle's grandeur could not erase the constant reminders of shared habitation. The structure itself echoed with the sounds and scents of the creatures that lived alongside its inhabitants, shaping their daily experience in ways both subtle and overpowering. The creatures that wandered through the castle revealed a truth far removed from the polished image of noble life. With every sound and scent, they reshaped the boundaries between comfort and necessity within the stone walls. Deep within the castle's daily rhythm waited another reminder of just how deeply survival blurred the lines between order and chaos. Air inside a medieval castle carried a heaviness that touched every part of daily life. Thick stone walls, admired for their strength and protection, allowed almost no circulation, trapping smells and moisture in every corridor and chamber. Windows were narrow slits designed more for defense than comfort, letting in just enough light to reveal the outlines of rooms but not enough air to refresh them. People moved through this confined atmosphere without expecting relief, accustomed to the sensation of breathing air that never truly felt clean. The castle was a fortress, but it was also a container that held everything: smoke, sweat, dust, and the warmth of countless bodies living in proximity. Cooking fires burned throughout the day, sending streams of smoke upward into rafters and across hallways. Chimneys were inefficient, often releasing more soot into the rooms than out into the open air. The smoke clung to walls, darkening their surfaces over time, leaving a fine, gritty layer on furniture and fabrics. Servants working near the kitchens inhaled the thick fumes constantly, their throats stinging as they carried food through narrow doorways. Nobles sitting in great halls felt the haze drift across their gatherings, settling into tapestries and clothing with a smell that could not be washed out easily. It is strikingly ironic that walls designed to protect people also trapped the very elements that eroded their comfort. Those who lived inside accepted the discomfort as simply part of the castle's nature. Alongside the smoke came the smell of bodies. With limited bathing and constant labor, people carried the scent of sweat and dirt that clung to skin and clothing alike. Even nobles with access to perfumes and oils could only mask the odor temporarily. In crowded gatherings, the combination of smoke, sweat, and lingering scents from meals created a thick atmosphere that filled the chest and made breathing feel slow and heavy. If we compare this to modern expectations, it resembles spending entire days inside a windowless room filled with smoke and stale air, a condition most people today would find unbearable. Yet for castle residents, this was the foundation of everyday life. Animals added their own contribution to the environment. The smell of damp fur from dogs resting near hearths, the scent of horses in adjacent courtyards, and the unavoidable odor of animal waste drifting through hallways merged into the already dense air. These scents mingled with the musty smell of straw-covered floors, producing an atmosphere that shifted between sharp and sour, depending on the time of day. Servants accustomed to long hours noticed these changes as part of their routine. Nobles noticed them only in passing, often unaware of how deeply the castle's air shaped their experience. The limited airflow also meant illness spread quickly. When someone fell sick, the stale air within the castle kept the sickness close, allowing it to pass from room to room with ease. Without understanding how the disease traveled, people blamed spirits, weather, or fate. They did not realize that the air they breathed kept illnesses lingering far longer than they should have. During winter months, when windows remained shut against the cold, the concentration of trapped air grew intense, making headaches, dizziness, and coughing increasingly common. Servants and guards who spent long hours in confined spaces suffered most. Lighting conditions added another layer to the discomfort. Torches and candles were used throughout the castle, each one releasing additional smoke that blended with the haze already present. The dim lighting cast shadows across rooms, highlighting floating particles that sparkled briefly before sinking into layers of dust. Servants wiped surfaces constantly, but the dust returned within hours. Breathing in such an environment felt heavy, and many people carried a persistent sense of fatigue. Rooms used for gatherings were especially stifling. Great halls filled quickly during feasts, and with so many bodies gathered together, the temperature rose fast. Warm air mixed with the smell of roasted meat and spilled wine, creating a suffocating atmosphere. People fanned themselves or opened doors briefly to let in a small rush of fresh air, but the relief never lasted long. When music played or speeches were given, the shifting movement of people stirred the air only enough to circulate the haze rather than clear it. Sleeping quarters offered little escape. Heavy curtains around beds blocked what little airflow existed, trapping warmth and scent beneath them. During the night, people exhaled moisture that collected on the fabric, adding to the mustiness by morning. Straw mattresses, already damp with age, absorbed the scent of human breath, sweat, and occasional illness. Waking in such conditions meant starting each day with a chest full of stale air, a feeling so ordinary that few questioned it. Servants often bore the worst of it. They worked near fires, moved through dusty storage rooms, and cleaned spaces that rarely received fresh air. Their lungs adapted slowly to the conditions, but many experienced persistent coughs or respiratory discomfort. The cold stone walls held moisture long after fires were extinguished, and drafts moved inconsistently through corridors, never enough to clean the atmosphere, but enough to carry irritants from one place to another. Despite all this, the castle's occupants viewed their environment with acceptance. The air was heavy, but it was their home. The discomfort became part of daily life, folded into the routines that shaped their existence. Over time, people stopped noticing the smell or the haze drifting across rooms, their senses dulled by constant exposure. The air they breathed revealed more about the castle's reality than any ceremony or decoration ever could. Each breath carried traces of smoke, sweat, and the countless bodies that shared the same confined space. Within that dense atmosphere waited another reminder of how survival demanded constant endurance behind stone walls. Bathing was not a familiar part of medieval life, and its absence shaped the daily experience of nearly everyone inside the castle. Water itself carried risks, as people believed that exposing the body to it made them vulnerable to illness. Warm baths opened the pores, allowing sickness to enter, or so the common belief went. As a result, many avoided full bathing entirely, viewing it as unnecessary at best and dangerous at worst. What passed for cleanliness consisted mainly of wiping the body with damp cloths or scented mixtures that covered odor rather than removed it. The idea of immersing oneself in water simply did not belong to their understanding of health. Ritual and practicality both shaped this behavior. The effort required to heat large amounts of water was significant, and fuel was not always available in abundance. Carrying water through cold corridors, warming it over smoky fires, and filling wooden tubs demanded time and labor that servants could rarely spare. Only nobles bathed on rare occasions, and even then under strict supervision, which reflected the belief that bathing weakened the body. Servants merely used cold basins or wiped sweat from their skin before returning to work. Cleanliness was less about removing dirt and more about adjusting to the expectations of the environment. The body accumulated layers of sweat, dust, and oils that clung to the skin throughout the day. Laborers working near fires or carrying heavy loads perspired constantly, and with few opportunities to wash, the sweat dried into a gritty layer that mixed with dust from straw-covered floors. Even those who performed lighter tasks were not spared, as the confined atmosphere within the castle added moisture and heat that encouraged sweating. The skin gradually took on a texture shaped by labor and environment, marked by dryness, roughness, and a faint but persistent sheen of dirt. People masked these odors with scented oils or herbs, but these remedies offered only temporary relief. Perfumes mixed with sweat produced sharper smells rather than eliminating them. Clothing worn repeatedly without washing absorbed these scents and released them slowly throughout the day. It is almost darkly amusing that fragrances meant to suggest refinement ended up intensifying the very odors they attempted to hide. Laundry required significant effort and water, making frequent washing impossible, so people learned to tolerate smells that modern standards would consider overwhelming. Cleaning rituals focused more on visible areas. Faces and hands were wiped regularly, as these parts of the body were most exposed. Servants maintained appearances for noble households by cleaning what others would see first, but the rest of the body remained largely untouched. Hair washing was rare, and instead, scented powders were sprinkled onto the scalp to absorb oil and reduce odor. This practice created thick layers that built up over time, causing itching and dryness. If we imagine this routine through today's lens, it equates to living with a permanent coating of dust and sweat, maintained only by periodic wiping rather than actual cleansing. People adapted to this sensation, viewing discomfort as a constant companion. Those who worked outdoors faced additional challenges. Mud clung to their legs and hems of clothing during rainy seasons, drying into flakes that fell off indoors or remained attached for days. The mixture of soil, sweat, and straw became part of their stride as they moved through courtyards and halls. Even nobles who spent time on horseback accumulated dust from the roads, which settled into their garments and hair. Removing these particles required thorough washing, a luxury that neither time nor belief permitted. Bathhouses did exist in some regions, but their reputation was mixed. Many associated them with immorality or illness, and rumors of disease spreading in communal baths discouraged attendance. Others viewed them as indulgent or wasteful, making them appropriate only for certain ceremonies or rare moments of leisure. Within castle walls, such places were often absent entirely, leaving residents reliant on minimal cleaning rituals that barely touched the deeper layers of grime. Children grew up accustomed to the sensation of unwashed skin, learning early that bathing was reserved for unique occasions. Their games and chores added dirt daily, and parents concerned more with survival than hygiene accepted this as normal. Illnesses related to poor hygiene went unrecognized as preventable. Instead, people attributed them to the seasoned divine will, or the unpredictable nature of life. The connection between cleanliness and health simply did not exist in their understanding of the world. The castle's architecture deepened the problem. Thick stone walls trapped moisture and odors, making rooms feel heavy and damp. Even clean water stored indoors developed a stale smell after sitting for too long. Washing inside, such an environment offered little sense of refreshment. Cloths used for wiping the body dried slowly and developed their own odors, which transferred back onto the skin during use. Despite all of this, people took pride in their appearance. Clothing, even when unwashed, was arranged carefully. Hair was styled, powdered, or covered with caps and veils. These outward displays created the illusion of cleanliness, allowing nobles to maintain dignity despite the reality beneath their garments. Servants continued their routines, quietly, ensuring their employers appeared composed, even when their bodies carried layers of accumulated dirt. Sweat, dust, oils, and scented mixtures blended into the very atmosphere of the castle, shaping its identity as much as its stone walls. Cleanliness was a performance rather than a practice, an attempt to maintain order in a world where water carried fear and bathing demanded resources many could not spare. The state of their skin revealed far more than any perfume or garment could conceal. Each day added new layers of sweat, dust, and scent that shaped their understanding of comfort and survival. Deep within these routines waited another reminder of how limited knowledge transformed even the simplest acts into challenges. Nighttime inside a medieval castle brought a stillness that revealed the practical realities of living within stone walls. In the darkness, when corridors were cold and unlit, people relied on chamber pots to avoid walking long distances to garderobes or outdoor areas. These pots, usually made of metal or ceramic, sat near beds or beneath small tables, ready to be used whenever nature demanded. Their presence was not unusual. They were a necessity shaped by architecture and fear of the night. The stone floors were cold, the halls drafty, and moving through them in the dark risked injury or encounter with animals that wandered inside. Convenience mattered more than comfort, and so each bedroom became its own crude latrine after sunset. By morning, the room carried the weight of the night's use. The scent of urine drifted upward from the chamber pot, mixing with the stale air trapped behind curtains and thick stone walls. Servants entered bedrooms early to remove the pots, careful not to spill their contents as they carried them through narrow corridors. They walked quickly, their hands steady, bringing the waste to the courtyard or designated dumping areas. Despite their efforts, the smell lingered. It is almost bleakly amusing that the very rooms associated with privacy and rest were also among the most contaminated spaces in the castle. Even when the pots were emptied and washed, the scent embedded itself in fabric, wood, and stone. The floor absorbed much of this reality. When accidents happened, and they often did, urine spilled onto floorboards or seeped between gaps in wooden planks. Stone floors absorbed moisture slowly, allowing the scent to remain for days or weeks. No amount of scrubbing fully removed it. The smell mixed with the musty odor of straw sweat and the dampness that clung to the castle air. Over time, the scent of urine became part of the room's identity, something residents tolerated without expecting improvement. If we imagine this through a modern lens, it resembles sleeping every night beside an unemptied container of waste, accepting the scent as a natural part of life. For castle residents, practicality overshadowed discomfort. Servants bore the greatest burden. They woke early to clean pots that had sat in rooms throughout the night, the contents sometimes sloshing as they carried them across uneven floors. Their hands, often without gloves, touched the warm surfaces of recently used containers. Washing these pots required hauling water, scrubbing with limited supplies, and repeating the task room after room. Even after cleaning the pots, retained faint odors that intensified during the next night's use. For servants, this process became a daily ritual that shaped their mornings. Children learned early that chamber pots were an ordinary part of nighttime life. They used them without hesitation, sometimes missing or spilling in the process. Parents exhausted from labor or responsibilities accepted these small disasters as inevitable. The lingering scent became a reminder of the family's presence, woven into the fabric of the room. Stone, wood, and cloth absorbed these traces until they blended into the broader environment of the castle. Nobles attempted to refine this reality with decorated pots or privacy screens. Some chamber pots were painted, carved, or fitted with lids to reduce odor. These efforts made the practice appear more dignified, but did little to change the underlying experience. The pot still sat near the bed. The contents remained until morning. The smell still filled the room at night. Decorations softened the image, but not the reality. Guests visiting the castle encountered these practices without surprise. The use of chamber pots was universal, regardless of status or wealth. Travelers slept in guest rooms that held the same lingering odors as any other bedroom. They breathed the same air and woke to the same mixture of scents drifting through the corridors. What mattered was the convenience, not the cleanliness. Animals also influenced these nighttime routines. Dogs sleeping near beds occasionally knocked over chamber pots, spreading their contents across the floor. Cats exploring at night sometimes stepped into the pots or tracked moisture onto blankets. Servants discovered these situations in the morning, adding yet another layer to their cleaning duties. The presence of animals in bedrooms made spills more frequent and the work of maintaining minimal cleanliness more difficult. The architecture of the castle reinforced this system. Indoor plumbing did not exist, and garderobes were often located far from living quarters. Walking through cold, unlit hallways at night was unpleasant and dangerous. Chamber pots solved these problems while introducing new ones. The rooms provided privacy but not sanitation, creating an environment where waste accumulated silently through the night. Despite the discomfort, people did not consider alternatives. The practice was deeply embedded in daily life, shaped by necessity rather than preference. Residents grew accustomed to the smell, the sight of pots, and the morning rituals that followed. Cleanliness was not defined by the absence of odor, but by the ability to function within the environment without complaint. The lingering scent embedded in wood and stone became part of the castle's atmosphere. It mixed with other daily odors, smoke, sweat animals, and straw, forming a blend that defined the lived experience behind the castle's imposing walls. The grandeur, seen from the outside, obscured the intimate realities within. The quiet presence of the chamber pot revealed more about nightly life than any tale of luxury ever could. Each morning carried the reminder of how necessity shaped comfort within the castle's confined spaces. Beneath those familiar routines waited another truth about how waste and daily living became inseparable in the world behind stone walls. Laundry in a medieval castle was not a routine task but an event, difficult, exhausting, and postponed for as long as possible. Clothing absorbed the smells of sweat, smoke animals, and the dampness trapped within the stone walls, yet washing it was far from simple. Water had to be hauled from streams, wells, or nearby ponds, often icy cold and murky. Heating it required fuel and time, both of which were precious. Without the soaps and detergents familiar today, cleaning relied on physical strength rather than chemistry. Servants lifted heavy garments soaked with water, their arms aching from the weight long before the scrubbing even began. The absence of modern soap created an immediate challenge. Instead, people used ashes, clay, or rough sand to scour fabric. These substances scraped away dirt but also damaged the material, thinning cloth and fraying threads with each wash. Because washing shortened the lifespan of garments, people washed only when necessary. Clothing was aired out more often than cleaned, hung near windows or fires, in the hope that unpleasant smells might drift away. The attempt rarely succeeded. It is almost bleakly amusing how people believed that fresh air alone could erase layers of sweat, smoke, and grime embedded deep into the fabric. The truth lay heavy on every garment, clinging in ways no breeze could undo. When washing did occur, it often took place far from the castle itself. Servants travelled to streams or muddy riverbanks carrying bundles of clothing on their backs or in worn wooden carts. Kneeling on wet ground, they beat the garments against rocks or wooden boards, loosening dirt through force. Their hands, numbed in cold water, reddened from the repeated motions of scrubbing and wringing. The stream carried away some of the dirt but introduced its own impurities, sediment, plant matter, and the remnants of other activities upstream. If we compare this to a modern process, it resembles cleaning delicate garments using nothing but river mud, bare hands, and hope. Yet this was the only method available, a practice shaped not by choice but by necessity. Drying the clothing posed its own challenges. Garments were hung over bushes, branches, or makeshift lines strung between trees. Wind carried dust that settled into the damp fabric, and sudden rain forced servants to scramble to save their work. Even when drying succeeded, the garments rarely smelled clean. They carried hints of the river, the smoke from nearby fires, and the persistent odor of the bodies that had worn them. Nonetheless, people considered them refreshed, grateful for even a temporary reduction in the overwhelming scent of daily life. Nobles approached the issue differently. Instead of frequent washing, they relied heavily on perfumes, scented oils, and linen undergarments meant to absorb sweat. The outer garments, those made of expensive fabrics, were rarely washed at all. Washing risked damaging the fine material, so servants brushed and aired it instead. The scents applied to disguise odors were often mixed with the underlying grime, creating complex layers of smell that drifted through the halls during gatherings. I find it unsettling how carefully arranged appearances mask the reality beneath, making cleanliness a performance rather than a condition. Perfume suggested refinement, yet the garments carried stories of days, weeks, or even months without washing. Servants suffered the full weight of this work. Their laundry tasks were physically draining, requiring strength to lift soaked garments and endurance to scrub for hours. They returned to the castle soaked to the knees, their clothes splattered with mud and soapless residue, their hands cracked from exposure to cold water and harsh cleaning materials. Despite the effort, they knew the results would last only briefly. Within days, clothing would again absorb the smells of the castle animal waste from corridors, smoke from kitchens, sweat from labor, and moisture trapped in heavy fabrics. Even bed linens were washed infrequently. Straw mattresses absorbed bodily fluids, sweat, and spilled drinks, but washing their coverings happened only occasionally. The difficulty of removing and cleaning them discouraged frequent laundering. Curtains, tapestries, and decorative fabrics collected dust and smells in equal measure, never seeing water at all. The castle's grandeur concealed a world where textiles held layers of history, sweat, smoke, meals, illness, all woven into their fibers. The lack of washing also encouraged insects to remain in clothing. Fleas and lice hid in seams, feeding on the people who wore the garments. Washing could temporarily reduce infestations, but the difficulty of the task meant it happened too rarely to control the problem. Clothing became both shelter and transportation for pests, carrying them from room to room throughout the castle. Seasonal changes influenced the workload. In winter, water sources froze, making laundering nearly impossible. Clothing accumulated grime for months until warmer weather finally allowed washing again. In summer, drying was easier, but the heat intensified odors trapped in garments, making the need for cleaning more urgent. Regardless of the season, laundry remained one of the most labor-intensive and least appreciated tasks in the castle. People accepted this reality because they had no alternative. Clothing reflected status, but not cleanliness, and even the wealthiest residents resigned themselves to the limitations imposed by their environment. The act of laundering represented a struggle against nature, architecture, and time, a temporary attempt to create order in a world where dirt and smell were constant companions. The weight of the laundry revealed more about castle life than any fine garment ever could. Each washed cloth carried the memory of effort, scarcity, and the limits of daily living behind stone walls. Beyond these brief moments of cleanliness, waited another reminder of how survival shaped every task, no matter how ordinary it seemed. Disease thrived inside medieval castles because the conditions allowed it to spread quietly, steadily, and without resistance. Filth built up in corners under staircases and along the edges of rooms where straw and dust collected into thick layers. People walked past it daily, unaware that the small particles rising into the air carried more than just unpleasant smells. No one fully understood how sickness spread, so the waste, dirt, and decay that filled castle life remained unchallenged. As long as the outer walls stood strong, people believed they were protected, even as danger moved silently within those very walls. Rats became constant residents, slipping through cracks in stone foundations, running along corridors, and nesting beneath storage areas. Drawn by food scraps and the warmth of the castle, they multiplied quickly. Their movements left trails of waste, fur, and fleas, each one capable of carrying diseases that people could not see. Residents grew accustomed to the scratching of tiny feet behind walls, treating it as part of the building's natural sounds. It is almost bleakly humorous that a structure built to keep out armies could not keep out creatures small enough to disappear beneath doorframes. The rats settled into every available space, surviving on crumbs left behind after meals and waste that accumulated in dark corners. Trash was rarely removed with urgency. Food scraps, bones, and spoiled leftovers were piled near kitchens or in courtyards until servants had time to haul them away. Rain turned these piles into foul-smelling mounds that attracted flies and other insects. The air thickened with the scent of rot drifting into storerooms and hallways. People lived with this smell daily, never realizing that each inhalation carried invisible threats. The castle's poor ventilation trapped these fumes inside, allowing them to circulate through rooms where families slept, worked, and ate. Diseases like the plague, skin infections, and severe diarrhea moved swiftly in such an environment. Fleas that lived on rats transferred easily to humans, biting skin and spreading illness before anyone noticed the signs. Once sickness began, it passed through households rapidly due to the dense, stagnant air within the stone walls. Bedrooms that held chamber pots, damp straw, and unwashed bedding became perfect spaces for bacteria to multiply. Servants caring for the sick carried the germs on their clothing as they moved through hallways, unknowingly extending the reach of each infection. Symptoms appeared suddenly. People woke with swollen lymph nodes, fevers that left them trembling, or rashes that spread along their arms and legs. They blamed spirits, curses, or foul weather rather than the environment that surrounded them daily. Without understanding germs or sanitation, they accepted sickness as part of life, believing it chose its victims without pattern. If we imagine this through modern understanding, it resembles living in a maze where every surface creature and breath carries a hidden risk, yet no one knows how to avoid it. Fear, mixed with confusion, creating resigned acceptance rather than preventative action. Flies added to the problem. Attracted to waste and spoiled food, they moved easily between refuse and meals, landing on bread, roasted meat, and cups of water. Their presence was constant, their buzzing as much a part of the castle's soundscape as the clatter of boots. No one attempted to drive them away for long, as they returned within moments. Their legs and wings carried particles from decaying matter, depositing them onto the very food nobles consumed. Illness that followed such meals was attributed to fate, not the insects walking across every dish. Water sources contributed further danger. Wells, located within or near the castle, often became contaminated by runoff from waste areas or animal pens. Rain washed filth downward, seeping into the earth and mixing with drinking water. Servants who fetched water did not question its clarity or smell. They had no alternative. The water was used for cooking, cleaning, and drinking, increasing the risk of infection in every part of daily life. When people fell ill afterward, the connection remained unseen. Crowded living conditions magnified the spread of disease. Families often slept in the same room, sharing bedding and breathing the same stale air. Servants slept nearby or in adjoining spaces, creating a chain of contact that allowed sickness to pass quickly. Warmth from bodies, moisture from breathing, and the lack of ventilation created an environment where illness found no resistance. Skin infections spread through shared clothing, while intestinal diseases circulated through contaminated food and water. The castle's structure, intended for security, unintentionally became a vessel for sickness. Despite the frequency of the disease, people continued their routines. They worked, cooked, fed animals, and gathered for meals, unaware that the environment around them contributed to their suffering. Children grew up witnessing sickness as a common occurrence, learning early that life inside stone walls carried risks no one understood. The grandeur of the castle could not disguise the frailty of its inhabitants. Every layer of stone and every tapestry hung on the walls hid the truth that illness was woven into the very fabric of the building. Sick rooms offered little relief. Straw bedding trapped moisture and smells mixing with sweat and waste. Windows remained shut against the cold, or opened only briefly, letting in little fresh air. Those caring for the sick often fell ill themselves, repeating a cycle so familiar that no one questioned its cause. The castle remained a fortress against invaders, yet it surrendered daily to the forces of disease. The spread of illness revealed far more about castle life than any tale of bravery or grandeur. Each breath carried traces of the decay and neglect embedded within the stone walls. Beneath these realities waited another reminder of how survival depended on choices no one fully understood. The layout of a medieval castle often placed the kitchen and the stables uncomfortably close to one another, a choice shaped by practicality rather than hygiene. Food had to be prepared quickly, and horses had to be ready at all times, so both spaces were positioned near the heart of activity. This arrangement created an environment where the smells of cooking and the odors of animals blended into a single, unmistakable haze. Smoke from fires drifted into the stable area, while the heavy scent of manure seeped into the kitchen through shared walls or open passages. For those who lived and worked there, this mixture became a daily reality they rarely questioned. In the kitchen, servants worked over large hearths, where pots simmered with broths and stews. Flames snapped beneath iron cauldrons, as workers chopped vegetables, carved meat, and fetched water from nearby sources. But the water they used often came from ponds or shallow wells located near the stables. The runoff from animal waste sometimes flowed into these water sources, especially after rain. Servants had no means to purify it, so they used it as it was cloudy, metallic tasting, and sometimes carrying debris. It is almost bleakly amusing that meals prepared with such effort began with water drawn from places where horses drank and relieved themselves. The boundary between nourishment and contamination remained thin. The stables themselves were bustling places. Horses stamped their hooves, snorted and shook their manes, sending dust and bits of hay swirling through the air. Their waste accumulated quickly, even with regular cleaning. The scent of manure and damp straw clung to the walls, drifting toward the kitchen with every shift of wind. Stable hands carried the smell on their clothing as they moved through shared corridors, sometimes helping in other tasks without changing garments. These transitions made the separation between clean and unclean nearly impossible to maintain. Flies gathered in large numbers, feeding on waste in the stables, before fluttering into the kitchen to land on bowls, cutting boards, and pots filled with ingredients. Servants swatted them away while working, but the insects returned immediately, drawn by the warmth and the scent of food. Raw meat, left on wooden tables, attracted both flies and dogs that wandered through the kitchen hoping for scraps. If we consider this through modern expectations, it resembles preparing meals beside a barn without any structural barrier in place, accepting that dust, insects, and odors will join each dish. Yet people of the time accepted it as unavoidable. The noise created a chaotic rhythm. Horses neighing hooves, striking the ground, dogs barking for scraps and pots, clanging together, all blended into one continuous soundtrack. Servants had to raise their voices to communicate, while stable workers shouted instructions to one another. The two worlds, food preparation and animal care, are intertwined so closely that neither operates independently. Those who cooked knew the rhythms of the stables, and those who worked with horses became familiar with the scents drifting from the kitchen hearths. Food stored in nearby rooms often absorbed the surrounding odors. Grain kept in sacks took on a faint smell of manure, while salted meat hung near stable walls picked up traces of the dampness that seeped through stone. Bread baked in the kitchen cooled on wooden boards, positioned near open passages, leaving it vulnerable to dust carried in from the stables. People ate these foods without complaint, recognizing the flavors and scents as normal parts of castle life. The architecture offered little help. Narrow corridors circulated air unevenly, trapping smells that intensified in certain corners. Doors meant to separate areas rarely sealed completely, leaving gaps through which odors and insects passed. In winter, when temperatures dropped, people kept doors open to let heat travel between rooms, further blending the scents of cooking and horses. In summer, the heat amplified all smells, making the air thick and heavy. Despite the challenges, both spaces were essential. The kitchen provided nourishment for the entire castle, while the stables ensured transportation, communication, and defense. The proximity that caused discomfort also made daily operations more efficient. Servants could quickly deliver meals to stable hands, and riders could leave the castle promptly in emergencies. Practicality outweighed cleanliness in nearly every decision. Those who worked in the kitchen adjusted to the conditions over time. Their clothing absorbed the mixture of smoke, sweat, and stable odors, becoming part of their identity. Their hands, rough from work, carried traces of the environment into every dish served at noble tables. Nobles dining in decorated halls rarely paused to consider how their meals had begun. They tasted the richness of roasted meats and seasoned stews without sensing the environment that shaped them. The stables, too, carried signs of the shared environment. Fragments of food scraps ended up near hay piles, and animals chewed happily on bits tossed aside by servants. Dogs moved freely between both spaces, tracking mud, straw, and waste into the kitchen and back out again. This closeness between animals and food underscored a broader truth about medieval life. The concept of cleanliness differed greatly from modern standards. People valued survival efficiency and practicality. Comfort was secondary, and separation between clean and dirty spaces was a luxury they did not possess. The arrangement of the kitchen and stable revealed more about castle life than any polished feast ever could. Each scent and sound carried signs of a world where practicality overshadowed every attempt at refinement. Within those shared spaces waited another reminder of how deeply necessity shaped even the most basic routines. Hunting was one of the most celebrated activities in medieval castle life. Yet the aftermath of each hunt revealed a far less dignified reality. After riders returned from forests carrying deer, boar, or smaller game, the castle transformed into a place filled with blood, flesh, and the unmistakable smell of raw meat. Carcasses were dragged into designated workrooms or courtyards, where servants began the long process of butchering. The floor quickly became slick with blood, as knives cut through thick hides and exposed organs. Cold air often did little to slow the spread of odor, and within minutes, the scent of iron and decay drifted through nearby hallways. The meat was rarely processed immediately. Carcasses hung from wooden beams or hooks, swaying slightly as drafts moved through the room. Without methods to preserve meat effectively, people relied on cold weather or smoke to delay spoilage. But in many cases, meat hung for days before being fully prepared, darkening and stiffening as blood pooled beneath it. It is almost grimly amusing that the same nobles who admired the glory of the hunt ate meals prepared in rooms where raw meat had hung for so long that flies nested comfortably in its folds. Servants brushed insects away constantly, though. They returned again and again. The floor quickly absorbed the consequences of the hunt. Blood pooled in uneven stone grooves, forming sticky patches that darkened as they dried. When servants washed the area, they used cold water and old cloths that spread the blood more than they removed it. Straw scattered across the ground, soaked up liquid, but left behind stains and a lingering smell that never fully faded. The damp mixture of blood, dirt, and water created a surface that clung to shoes and animal paws, tracking traces of the butchering process throughout the castle. Organs often posed an additional challenge. Some were used for cooking, while others were discarded in piles that attracted swarms of flies within minutes. The exposed entrails glistened under torchlight, and the sound of insects buzzing overhead became part of the atmosphere. Dogs lingered eagerly near the piles, sniffing and waiting for scraps to fall. Their presence added to the chaos, pushing servants to work quickly while trying to keep animals from consuming the wrong pieces. If we imagine this scene through a modern lens, it resembles preparing food in a room where sanitation does not exist. Pests move freely, and blood is a permanent part of the floor's surface. It was a world shaped by necessity, not cleanliness. The smell spread beyond the butchering area. Metallic and sharp at first, it grew more pungent as hours passed. The scent travelled upward into hallways, drifting into rooms where nobles gathered and settled into tapestries that hung along the walls. Even the great hall decorated with banners and polished wood could not escape the faint trace of the hunt. Guests dining there sometimes detected hints of raw meat in the air, though they rarely acknowledged it aloud. The atmosphere of the castle absorbed each hunt so deeply that the smell became part of its identity. Servants were responsible for cleaning the aftermath, though cleaning often meant little more than pushing remains aside. With limited tools and no disinfectants, they relied on rags, buckets of water, and handfuls of straw. They scrubbed until the visible blood faded, but stains remained, especially in cracks of the stone. Some corners darkened permanently, marked by years of repeated hunts. The smell lodged into the porous surfaces, resurfacing with each rise in temperature or shift in humidity. Tools used in butchering were rarely cleaned thoroughly. Knives wiped quickly on cloths retained thin layers of grease and blood. Cutting boards held deep grooves filled with residue. Hooks and beams stained over time, creating lines that recorded the history of each slaughter. Because these tools were used repeatedly without sterilization, bacteria spread easily, though no one understood the connection between cleanliness and illness. Cuts sustained while butchering often became infected, leaving servants with swollen hands and lingering fevers. Meat preparation for cooking carried its own risks. Servants handled the same carcasses they had just butchered, sometimes without washing their hands. They cut and seasoned meat, while flies landed on exposed surfaces. Dogs wandered between their legs, and cats perched on ledges waiting for scraps. Food carried the subtle scent of the butchering area, with smoke from the kitchen masks mixing with traces of raw flesh. Even when the hunting season ended, its effects remained. The rooms used for butchering retained their distinct smell year-round. Dried blood dulled the stone, and stains lingered in crevices servants could not reach. Visitors who walked through these spaces sensed a heaviness in the air, a mixture of iron, damp straw, and the echoes of countless hunts. The grandeur of castle life, so celebrated in stories, dissolved quickly in these rooms where survival overshadowed ceremony. Despite the discomfort, hunting was celebrated as a noble pursuit. The feasts that followed, each excursion highlighted the wealth and power of the castle's residents. Behind the scenes, however, the cost of these celebrations lay in the blood that covered the floors, the insects that gathered, and the lingering smell that never truly left the walls. The remnants of each hunt revealed more about castle life than any triumph displayed at the banquet table. Every stain and lingering scent carried proof of how deeply survival shaped the rhythms inside those stone walls. Across those uneasy spaces lay another reminder of how discomfort and necessity merged in ways few people ever imagined today. Anyone standing near a medieval castle for the first time might expect its walls to guard not only people, but also the cleanliness of daily life. Yet the truth behind how wastewater was handled reveals a reality far more precarious. Inside those stone barriers, nothing close to a proper disposal system existed. Water used for cooking, washing, cleaning, or any other routine had only one destination outward through crude channels or buckets carried by hand. Once dumped, it mixed with everything already flowing away from the castle, turning the surrounding land and waterways into silent carriers of contamination no one fully understood. People accepted this arrangement because it was the only one they knew, but acceptance did not lessen its consequences. Water, drawn from nearby rivers or moats, became the foundation of daily tasks, despite being part of the same cycle of contamination. Residents filled jars from it, boiled food in it, washed their faces with it, and relied on it for drinking whenever alternatives ran out. Yet that same water received waste from kitchens, refuse from scrubbing floors, and even runoff from chamber pots. The contradiction was obvious only in hindsight. For medieval people, illness felt constant, unpredictable, and detached from their habits. They blamed misfortune, weather changes, or divine displeasure, rather than the contaminated water surrounding them. Rivers became extensions of the castle's routines, rather than independent natural features. Servants poured wastewater down slopes that funneled directly toward the banks. Rain carried ash scraps and debris from rooftops in the same direction. Pools of murky liquid collected in low spots, forming stagnant patches. Still, residents returned day after day to fetch water they believed was simply part of life. Clean water did not exist as a concept. Only accessible water mattered. Their hope that the current would wash away impurities replaced any real understanding of sanitation. Inside the castle, the lack of structured waste channels created constant obstacles. Floors remained damp from spills that never fully evaporated. Gutters carved into stone clogged with grime. Servants waded through puddles of diluted waste while carrying buckets to and from the river. Once tossed out, the wastewater was forgotten instantly. Nobody wondered where it went, how it mixed, or who might encounter it later. The castle might have looked formidable against armies, but it had no defenses against its own habits. Outbreaks of illness were woven into the rhythm of life. After heavy rainfall, when the river water churned with new contaminants, more residents fell sick. Children weakened, first suffering fevers and stomach cramps that adults dismissed as ordinary misfortune. Because nearly everyone experienced sickness at some point, it blended into the background. No one identified patterns. Cleanliness was measured not by hygiene but by social appearance. A noble could remain unwashed and still appear respectable, while a kitchen that looked tidy could poison its workers through contaminated water. Collecting water became a ritual shaped entirely by necessity. Servants reached into the same river spots where they had emptied foul water the day before. Sometimes the current carried debris away. Other times it deposited more at their feet. During winter, ice seals contaminants beneath the surface only to release them in the thaw. During the summer, algae bloomed in thick layers. Complaints about taste or smell arose but rarely led to change. People lacked both the knowledge and the means to seek alternatives. A few attempts at improving water quality existed, but were inconsistent. Some households allowed water to sit overnight so sediment could settle. Others boiled it when firewood was abundant, though this practice varied widely. Most drank it as it was trusting routine more than method. It seems almost ironic that a structure built to withstand sieges could not safeguard its residents from their own wastewater. From a distance, rivers and moats surrounding castles appeared serene. Their reflective surfaces hid what swirled beneath. Visitors saw shimmering water and imagined a harmonious environment. The truth lingered below contamination layered with routine necessity mixed with ignorance. Viewed through a modern understanding, the entire system resembles a slow, continuous cycle of self-inflicted hardship. Yet for those who lived through it, the water served as both resource and threat, neither of which they felt empowered to control. Understanding these conditions reveals a deeper portrait of medieval endurance. People survived not because their environment was healthy, but because their expectations were shaped by hardship. Illness was inevitable. Water was unavoidable. Life continued between those two realities. I often imagine how many stories ended quietly, because the dangers they faced were invisible to them. The polluted river revealed more about daily life around the castle than any record of wealth or power ever could. Each bucket drawn for cooking or washing carried the quiet reminder of how contamination shaped every routine. Across that murky water waited another truth about how survival bound the residents to a cycle they could never truly escape. Life inside a medieval castle was often described in stories as a world of banners, heraldry, and noble lineage. Yet much of its reality rested on surfaces that were far less dignified. The walls that seemed grand from a distance held layers of grime built up over years of daily living, and each stone carried traces of routines that left marks no one cared to examine closely. The people who walked those halls moved through spaces shaped by necessity, and the remains of their actions settled into corners without ceremony. The mixture of rags, dirt, food scraps, and other remnants of life slowly blended into the structure itself, creating stains that stayed long after their origins were forgotten. Even the floors, which were swept only when needed for appearances, absorbed fluids and odors that no tool available at the time could fully remove. Shadows on the walls and stains beneath benches were not signs of age alone. They were reminders of how closely filth and authority lived side by side. The stone corridors served as both pathways and repositories, collecting layers of dust and spilled liquids that hardened into permanent patches. When animals were slaughtered or game was brought in after a hunt, the blood that dripped onto the stones left marks that rarely faded. The tools used for cleaning were crude, often nothing more than old cloth or bundles of straw, which merely spread the mess rather than eliminating it. Servants moved through the castle with hurried steps, trying to reduce the visible signs of disorder, but the underlying accumulation of dirt was too deeply embedded to erase. The air itself carried the scent of this mixture, an odor of damp stone sweat, and the remains of tasks performed without thorough sanitation. Many rooms functioned as multi-purpose spaces used for dining, resting conversations, and minor procedures. When something was spilled or dropped, the cleanup was immediate, but rarely effective, leaving faint outlines that merged with older ones over time. Wooden beams darkened from repeated exposure to smoke and moisture, while corners of the castle held piles of ash swept aside from hearths. Every fire created residue, and every attempt to tidy the space added another layer to the existing build-up. These details, barely noticed by those who lived with them, accumulated into a quiet record of life hidden beneath the castle's exterior beauty. In some areas, especially storerooms and lower passages, the mixture of grime and waste became so ingrained that it seemed part of the architecture. The walls felt sticky from smoke and aging oils, and floors bore dark stains whose origins were no longer identifiable. During times of illness or conflict, when tension filled the air, the castle absorbed even more signs of distress. Blood from injuries, spilled food, or ash from burnt materials all left traces that could not be fully washed away. When the castle was described as old, it was not only because of the centuries it had stood, but because it carried the physical memory of everything that had happened within it. Those who lived there often ignored these signs. Life required constant movement, and people grew accustomed to what surrounded them. They stepped over darkened spots without a second glance, and leaned against walls without thinking about the residue beneath their hands. To them, this was simply part of existence, a normal condition of enclosed stone living. The castle's authority rested on power, not cleanliness, and the grandeur seen by outsiders had little to do with the realities inside its walls. When visitors arrived, the main halls were swept, surfaces were wiped, and torches were lit to cast warm light across the stone. Yet even then, the deeper marks could not be hidden. Those who looked closely might notice the uneven texture of the walls, or the faint discoloration beneath tapestries. Behind the illusion of control was a building that had absorbed years of human activity. Each stain, shadow, and imperfection, a quiet testament to the lives inside. The foundation of the castle was literal stone, but its day-to-day existence rested on layers of untidy history. Every stain told a story not of dramatic battles or royal decrees, but of the ordinary routines that kept the castle functioning. These marks were not romantic, nor were they easy to reconcile with the image of noble grandeur often shown in illustrations. Instead, they revealed how deeply filth and power intertwined, forming an inseparable part of medieval life. The glamour of the castle crumbled under close inspection, replaced by an understanding that the building operated as a complex machine fueled by labor mess and constant human presence. Even as residents moved through their routines, the castle continued to absorb evidence of everything that occurred within it. Spilled liquids seeped into crevices, ash settled into corners, and the remains of daily work added to the growing presence of grime. Over time, the castle became a vessel not only for authority, but also for the refuse of its inhabitants, capturing both power and decay in equal measure. This duality defined the true nature of the medieval fortress, a place where elegance was projected outward, while filth quietly accumulated beneath. The stains that marked the castle's surfaces offered a clearer view of daily life than any tale of noble honour. Each darkened corner hinted at the routines that shaped existence inside those walls. Hidden beneath the appearance of order lingered another reminder of how people endured the burdens woven into the castle's daily reality. Existing inside a medieval castle demanded a constant negotiation with discomfort, and nowhere was this more evident than in the corners where servants were expected to sleep. Their quarters were placed close to the areas that produced the most refuse, not because the spaces were suitable, but because convenience outweighed comfort. The garderobe chutes, washing pits, and storage corners shaped the boundaries of their nightly rest. Straw was spread across the ground in uneven layers, flattened by repeated use, and rarely refreshed, absorbing whatever liquids or debris happened to fall. The people who slept there did so in an environment defined by odour, dampness, and the quiet resignation of those who understood their position in the castle's hierarchy. The air around these spaces held layers of scent accumulated from daily routines. The garderobe nearby emitted a persistent heaviness, a mixture of stale moisture and waste settling deep into the stone. When the washing tubs were emptied, the splashes that missed the buckets soaked into the straw where servants tried to rest. These conditions lingered, shaping the night as much as the day. The idea of comfort did not exist in these spaces. Rest was simply the absence of movement, rather than a chance to recover. Throughout the day, the same rooms served multiple purposes, all of which added to the accumulation of grime. Tools coated in grease were rinsed in nearby corners, sending thin streams of oily water across the floor. Bits of food swept from tables found their way into the cracks of these areas, and fragments of bone or husks dropped during hurried cleanup remained trapped in the straw. Servants lived with the constant awareness that their sleeping area was never truly separated from waste. Yet they adapted because adaptation was their only option. Rodents were frequent visitors. Drawn by the scraps and residue left behind, they scurried through the bedding at night, their sounds forming an unwelcome but familiar backdrop. Insects settled into the straw, multiplying in the warmth created by bodies sleeping close together. Servants grew accustomed to brushing away fleas and lice before lying down, knowing that the battle against infestation was ongoing and largely unwinnable. These conditions shaped their routines so completely that many barely noticed them after years of living in such proximity to filth. Moisture added another layer of hardship. Water that collected during washing or cleaning never fully dried in the colder parts of the castle. The floors retained a damp chill that seeped through clothing and bedding, leaving servants cold even during warmer seasons. The straw spread across the floor absorbed this moisture, turning patches of it soft and foul-smelling. Each step into their quarters reminded them that the space they rested in bore the imprint of the castle's dirtiest work. Their bodies carried the evidence of these conditions. Their clothing retained the smell of refuse, and their hair absorbed the smoke, dampness, and grime that filled the corridors. Even when they washed, the results were temporary. Their proximity to waste shaped not only their living environment, but also how others perceived them. No one expected them to be clean. Cleanliness was a privilege reserved for those who did not labour in the castle's hidden corners. When night fell, the castle grew quieter, though not cleaner. Servants lay close together on the straw-covered floor, arranging their bodies to avoid the wettest or most infested patches. They listened to the sounds of dripping water, shifting rodents, and the occasional echo from the garderobe shaft. Each noise reminded them of the conditions they had learned to accept. Their rest was interrupted frequently, yet they rose before dawn each day to perform tasks that ensured others lived in relative comfort. Visitors rarely saw these quarters. Their understanding of the castle came from decorated halls, bright tapestries, and controlled presentations of order. The servants' spaces remained unseen, hidden in the dimmer corridors where refuse was transported and stored. This invisibility created a divide. Those who lived in luxury never had to confront the reality that supported their comfort. Meanwhile, the servants existed in shadows, commuting between labour and rest, in the same environment that generated the castle's daily waste. Their endurance formed the backbone of the castle's functioning. The sweeping, hauling, washing and clearing they performed each day directly connected them to the filth others wished to ignore. Their proximity to waste was not the result of neglect alone, but a structural expectation designed into the castle's operations. Those who lived in these spaces understood the castle not through stories of noble heritage, but through the texture of the straw beneath them and the smells that marked their nightly rest. Their experiences revealed a world often omitted from historical descriptions, a world shaped by necessity, sacrifice, and conditions few would tolerate now. Servants lived in the shadows of refuse, carrying out their duties without acknowledgement from those who benefited from their labor. What remained in their quarters was not just dirt, but the physical record of a life spent supporting a structure that rarely recognized their presence. The servants' hidden quarters revealed more about the castle's true nature than any grand hall or ceremony. Each breath drawn beside refuse showed how deeply labor and filth were intertwined in daily survival. Behind the castle's outward strength lingered another reminder of the people who endured its harshest burdens. Daily routines inside a medieval castle unfolded in ways that blurred the lines between living quarters, workspaces, and improvised areas for bodily care. Grooming, medical attention, and minor procedures did not have designated rooms with sanitation in mind. Instead, these tasks often took place wherever space happened to be available, frequently in dining halls, side chambers, or corners near the hearth. The same tables used for meals became surfaces where hair was cut, wounds were stitched, or boils were drained. People accepted this arrangement as ordinary, even though the risks it carried were ever present. Tools used for these tasks were simple and frequently shared. A single knife might be used to cut bread earlier in the day and trim hair later in the afternoon. Scissors, dulled from repeated use, served both for fabric and for skin. There were no disinfectants to cleanse them, and the concept of microscopic infection was far beyond the understanding of the time. When tools were wiped clean, it was usually with a cloth already marked by grease, dust, or old stains. The idea of maintaining a sterile environment simply did not exist, and the consequences of this absence spread silently through the castle's inhabitants. Minor injuries were treated on the spot, but the methods used often worsened the condition. A splinter removed with a knife carried remnants from previous tasks. A cut, shaved too closely by a blade, left small openings in the skin that quickly grew inflamed. Even the act of trimming hair or beards left behind tiny nicks that became gateways for infection. These problems were so common that they rarely caused alarm. People considered them normal aspects of living in such close quarters. The air in these improvised spaces carried a mix of smells: cooked meat, smoke, sweat, and the faint metallic scent of blood. When someone needed attention, others nearby continued their activities without interruption. A meal might resume only a few feet away from a servant being treated for a deep blister, or a nobleman having a boil lanced. Blood dripped onto floors already stained from earlier accidents, and no one questioned it. Cleaning was minimal and often delayed, allowing remnants of these procedures to settle into cracks in the stone. Infections spread quickly under such circumstances. A small cut could swell within days, turning hot to the touch and increasingly painful. People frequently wrapped these wounds with cloth torn from old garments, pressing it tightly and hoping the swelling would subside. When pus formed, it was sometimes drained with the same tool that caused the injury. The cycle of contamination continued without awareness of what caused it. Illness lingered, and those who survived carried scars not only from the wounds themselves, but from the crude methods used to treat them. The castle's environment contributed to the persistence of these infections. Dust floated freely through the air, settling on surfaces and wounds alike. Animals moving through the halls carried dirt, fur, and fleas, spreading bacteria without anyone recognizing the danger. People slept near open cuts, exposing them to straw moisture and insects. The smallest injury had countless opportunities to worsen, and many did. Chronic sores were so widespread that they became part of the visual landscape of medieval life. For the poor, access to better care was non-existent. They relied on basic remedies passed down through tradition: herbal compresses, heated stones, or rinsing with wine when available. These methods sometimes eased pain, but rarely halted infection entirely. Nobles fared little better despite having more resources. Their procedures were performed more privately, but still with the same tools and assumptions. Status offered comfort, not safety. The castle's residents lived with these risks because they had no alternative. They understood wounds in terms of visible harm, not invisible causes. Pain was a familiar companion, and the gradual worsening of an injury did not surprise anyone. Chronic infections led to limping weakness or long-term disability, shaping the rhythm of daily work. These outcomes were accepted as natural burdens rather than failures of hygiene. Visitors who entered the castle might be surprised to see a servant having a cut stitched beside a table set for food, or a soldier receiving treatment in a hallway still streaked with stains from past procedures. Yet such scenes were routine for those who lived there. The castle's grandeur existed alongside these practices, creating a stark contrast between its outer strength and the fragile bodies of its inhabitants. Even those responsible for performing minor medical tasks were often self-taught, learning through observation rather than instruction. They reused tools out of necessity, not carelessness. Nothing was wasted, including knives, cloths, or bowls that had already served several functions. Their work preserved lives even though the methods frequently caused additional harm. This duality shaped the environment, a place where survival depended on actions that unintentionally prolonged suffering. Over time, repeated infections weakened individuals, making them more vulnerable to illness. A simple wound could lead to fever, swelling, exhaustion, and in severe cases, death. Families and servants accepted these outcomes with resignation. The castle's structure stood firm, but the people inside often lived with fragile, compromised health shaped by the very routines they relied upon. These conditions revealed an essential truth about medieval existence. Strength was projected outward, while vulnerability spread quietly through the daily handling of wounds and tools. The castle's stone walls could withstand sieges, yet its residents faced a constant internal assault from infections born of necessity and ignorance. The untreated wounds inside the castle exposed more fragility than any battle fought beyond its gates. Each crude procedure showed how survival depended on methods that carried their own hidden cost. Beneath the routines of care lingered another reminder of how deeply vulnerability shaped life in those enclosed walls. Archaeological work around medieval castles has revealed details that written records often ignored, and these discoveries expose a version of daily life far removed from the stories of grandeur. Soil surrounding the outer walls carries layers of material left behind by centuries of human activity, and embedded within it is evidence that speaks directly to the daily conditions of those who lived and worked in these fortresses. When archaeologists dig into these layers, they uncover traces of waste that accumulated without structured disposal systems. The levels of contamination are not accidental, but the direct result of routines that depended on proximity to water sources and the absence of managed sanitation. Samples collected near drainage paths frequently contain unusually high concentrations of human and animal waste. This build-up did not occur over a few seasons, but accumulated slowly through repeated habits. Wastewater from kitchens, garderobes, and stables flowed outward without filtering, settling into the soil around the castle. As the years passed, this material blended into the ground, creating thick deposits that remained long after the buildings had changed or fallen into ruin. Excavations reveal these layers clearly, each compacted level reflecting the reality of life inside the walls. Animal remains are another consistent presence in the soil. Bones from livestock hunting byproducts and pets often appear mixed without distinction. The absence of designated burial or disposal sites meant that the remains of animals were frequently discarded wherever convenient. In periods of conflict or disease, the situation grew more complex, as human remains occasionally merged with animal remains in shared burial pits or informal disposal areas. These discoveries show that neat separation of species was not a priority, and the pressures of survival shaped decisions more than ritual or structure. In some ruins, archaeologists have found bones belonging to dogs, cats, pigs, and humans, all occupying the same compacted soil layers. These findings reveal how intertwined daily life and death were within castle communities. The people of the time did not maintain the boundaries modern societies expect. Waste remains and daily work flowed together, leaving behind a complex archaeological record that mirrors the practical nature of medieval existence. These layers of mixed remains provide insight into the social structure, labor demands, and environmental pressures that shaped each castle's operation. Even more striking are the traces preserved within the very walls of the castles. Fossilized waste trapped between stones has surprised researchers who expected walls to be clean structures built for defense and display. Instead, the gaps between stones, especially in lower sections near kitchens and garderobes, reveal the partial remains of human and animal waste pressed in during construction or added accidentally over centuries. These traces hardened into the structure, becoming part of the material fabric of the castle itself. The presence of fossilized waste inside walls explains how closely daily routines interacted with the physical architecture. Walls were not just barriers, but surfaces exposed to spills, leaks, and the haphazard movements of servants who carried waste without proper tools. Rainwater washing down outer walls often pulled refuse with it, allowing particles to lodge between stones. In older ruins, these materials have been sealed by time preserved in patterns that show how waste became embedded in the environment. Archaeologists studying these remains must analyze not only what the waste reveals about health and diet, but also what it indicates about living conditions. High levels of certain bacteria or parasites suggest ongoing exposure that would have affected residents' daily health. Mixed burial layers reveal the lack of structured disposal systems. Fossilized waste in walls shows how little separation existed between clean and dirty spaces. These discoveries describe a world held together by practical decisions rather than hygienic concerns. The concentration of contamination in certain areas also reveals the rhythms of life within the castle. For example, soil outside kitchen doors often holds layers of grease, fish, bones, and vegetable scraps, suggesting that these spots served as dumping grounds. Near the stables, manure appears in deep layers, showing how waste accumulated quickly without systematic removal. Along outer walls, traces of household waste blend with ash, from hearths forming compacted deposits that built up through repeated disposal over generations. These findings correct the romanticized image many people have of medieval castles. They were not pristine fortresses, but living spaces full of constant activity, and each action left behind a trace. Archaeology makes these traces visible, revealing how deeply the castle's physical structure absorbed the routines of the people who lived there. It shows that contamination was not an accident, but a feature of life shaped by the limitations of the time. The story the soil tells is not glamorous. It is a record of labor, survival, and the blending of human and animal presence. Even the walls, which from a distance appear solid and imposing, carry microscopic evidence of the waste that once surrounded them. These details remind us that the castle's grandeur was built atop layers of daily struggle and the unavoidable mess that came with life in a confined and heavily used environment. The true significance of these findings lies in how they reshape our understanding of medieval life. Instead of polished tales about noble families, the soil and stone show a landscape defined by necessity, improvisation, and limited means. The castle appears not only as a symbol of authority, but as a vessel that collects every aspect of human existence, from food and work to waste and decay. This archaeological record replaces idealized images with a grounded, unembellished history. The evidence preserved in soil and stone revealed more honesty about castle life than any surviving chronicle. Each buried trace showed how closely daily routines merged with waste, labor, and the pressures of survival. Hidden beneath layers of earth rested another reminder of the world that existed behind the fortress walls. Medieval castles are often remembered through images of grand arches, carved stone, and richly painted halls. But these impressions reveal only the surface of a world far more complicated. Visitors both then and now focused on the imposing height of towers, the detailed craftsmanship of tapestries, and the polished glow of ceremonial chambers. These features were designed to communicate elegance, authority, and permanence. Yet the deeper layers of the castle's structure tell another story, one shaped by daily pressures rather than artistry. Behind the decorative walls lay spaces that function more like crowded workstations than graceful residences. The architectural beauty that survives today hides these realities beneath its outward strength. The contrast between appearance and function became apparent the moment one stepped beyond the main halls. Rooms that seemed picture-perfect during formal gatherings transformed into chaotic, cramped spaces during the course of the day. Servants moved through narrow passages carrying waste food, tools, and water. Animals wandered through open doorways, leaving behind traces that no amount of sweeping ever fully removed. The castle functioned as a living machine, with every surface touched by labor rather than luxury. What appears elegant in artwork was in truth just one fragment of a space shaped by constant activity. The beauty displayed in tapestries and painted panels served a purpose. They were meant to distract the eye. Intricate designs drew attention upward away from the floor, which was darkened by stains no one could erase. Stone carvings framed entrances to rooms that smelled of smoke, sweat, and waste. Even the great halls, which modern imagination fills with music and feasts, were more commonly used for labor storage and improvised tasks. The grandeur was real but limited. It acted as a thin shell surrounding a core defined by practical needs. Architectural features that appear decorative today originally served to mask the messiness of medieval life. High windows allowed smoke to escape while keeping animals from entering. Alcoves and niches served as storage for tools or waste before it was hauled out. Carved stone columns hid cracks where rodents lived, and flooring that looks polished in paintings once bore layers of straw meant to trap dirt. These elements merged beauty with necessity, creating an illusion of order that could only be maintained for brief moments each day. Visitors invited to admire a castle rarely saw where servants slept, cooked, washed, or buried refuse. Their view was curated. They walked through the best rooms, saw the finest decorations, and experienced controlled lighting that softened the roughness of the walls. The hidden wings of the castle told a different story. Kitchens were hot, crowded, and dim, with tools stacked along walls stained by smoke. Storage rooms carried the scent of damp wood and spoiled grains. Passages between these spaces were narrow tunnels lined with grime accumulated over years of unending work. The contrast between these areas and the ceremonial chambers was stark enough to feel like stepping between two separate worlds. Even artistic depictions from the medieval period contributed to this selective memory. Painters captured royal banquets, hunting scenes, and religious ceremonies, yet rarely illustrated the filth that surrounded these events. Architecture became part of this filtered storytelling. Soaring arches and open courtyards suggested a life of order and harmony, leaving no sign of the refuse that filled the corners just out of sight. This selective depiction shaped how later generations understood castles, creating a gap between reality and the stories told through surviving art. Despite their beauty, the structures themselves preserved evidence of the hidden world beneath. Stone absorbed odors from waste and smoke. Foundations carried layers of compacted dirt from centuries of uncleaned floors. Beams above kitchens held residue from fires that burned constantly with little ventilation. When restorers clean or analyze these materials, they often uncover dark patches that reveal how thoroughly daily routines shaped the castle's internal environment. The elegance of the architecture becomes a frame holding the marks of an entirely different existence. The castle's design also reflected class divisions. Nobles lived in the upper chambers where decorations and sunlight were more common. Servants, labourers, and animals existed in the lower levels, where ventilation was weak and light scarce. These layers were intentionally separated, yet physically intertwined with the work of one group supporting the comfort of the other. Architectural beauty served as a shield hiding the dependence on labour that occurred just below the decorated ceilings. To understand the castle fully, one must examine both its polished surfaces and the traces left behind by the people who lived in its hidden spaces. The painted walls, carved stone, and ornamental furniture represented only a narrow fragment of life inside. The rest, the noise, the labour, the smells, the filth, became part of the building's structure, even if excluded from its artistic depictions. What survives today in architecture is the glamorous facade, but archaeology and historical accounts reveal the fuller landscape, a place where refinement existed alongside dirt, where elegance coexisted with survival, and where beauty masked. The hardships embedded into the castle's daily operations. The architectural legacy of these castles endures, but it must be understood as something layered and imperfect. Each stone holds a portion of the past. Not just the crafted portion, but the unmanaged, uncelebrated residue of ordinary life. This mixture of artistry and filth, prestige and struggle, is the true inheritance left behind by medieval castles. The surviving architecture revealed far less about castle life than the stories beneath its polished surfaces. Each decorated wall concealed routines shaped by labour waste and the pressure to maintain appearances. Within every crafted detail lingered another reminder of the world that existed beyond the reach of ornament. History often remembers medieval castles as monuments of endurance symbols, carved from stone to represent strength, power, and legacy. But those stones carried more than the weight of royal ambition. They also carried the waste, grime, and unspoken truths of the people who lived among them. The polished narratives passed down through time were never meant to reveal everything. For generations, the quiet filth resting beneath the surface was ignored, softened, or erased from public memory. Yet the castle walls still hold their secrets, and the ground around them still bears traces of what life truly was. These remnants speak more honestly than the stories shaped by pride. As centuries shifted and the world changed, the ruins continued to reveal what once lay beneath their grandeur. Every layer of dirt, every stain preserved in stone, every fragment uncovered by archaeologists draws a clearer picture of what existed behind the scenes. Life inside the castle was never a perfect arrangement of order and elegance. It was a constant negotiation between survival and necessity. People lived, worked, and suffered within those walls, and their experiences were woven into the structure as much as the stone blocks themselves. The stories told today often describe medieval life through the lens of romantic imagination. Knights in shining armor, tapestries glowing in firelight, and feasts that lasted through the night. Yet beneath these images lies the truth that few wished to acknowledge. Filth was a daily companion. Waste was unavoidable. Dirt and disease shaped choices far more than honor or chivalry. The myths told about castles allowed people to avoid confronting the reality of what it meant to live where sanitation did not exist, where illness moved quietly, and where the very architecture absorbed evidence of discomfort. The past has a way of softening itself when observed from a distance. Time blurs the harsh edges, replacing them with stories that comfort rather than disturb. But the reality of medieval fortresses was closer to a living organism, one that consumed and produced in equal measure. Decay was part of its function. Smoke etched itself into ceilings. Waste settled into corners. Blood spilled from wounds or hunts sank between the stones. Every mark preserved in the ruins is proof of lives spent close to discomfort, close to necessity, close to the parts of existence that written history often avoids describing. Those who lived within the castle did not have the luxury of romanticizing their surroundings. They smelled the waste in the halls, felt the dampness in the walls, heard the animals moving through the night, and learned to accept that filth was an inseparable part of their world. Even the most powerful residents could not escape the realities created by the lack of sanitation. Their comfort depended on the labor of others who worked in the shadows, enduring the worst conditions so that the upper halls might appear clean for a few brief hours. It is tempting to imagine that strength alone defined the medieval world, that castles stood as pure symbols of authority, untouched by the frailty of human needs. But strength is never separate from vulnerability. The castle walls protected, yet they also trapped. They sheltered, yet they contained the waste of hundreds of lives each day. The stones stood firm, but the people inside them faced constant risks from wounds, infections, contaminated water, and unrelenting exposure to filth. Their stories, though, rarely recorded live on, not through words, but through the traces they left in soil and stone. The grand hall might have captured attention, but the garderobe chute told the truth. Painted ceilings impressed guests, but dark stains beneath rushes on the floor revealed what happened after the torches dimmed. Every corner that held waste, every crevice that trapped soot, every mark sealed into the walls formed the hidden legacy of these fortresses. These details do not diminish their historical significance. Instead, they deepen it. They remind us that history was lived by real people, not legends, and that those people carried the weight of conditions we can hardly imagine today. When night fell inside a medieval castle, the world grew quiet. Yet the smells lingered, the stains remained, and the structure itself continued to hold the memory of the day. Fires burned low, leaving the scent of smoke drifting through long corridors. Servants closed their eyes beside piles of waste they would clean at dawn. Nobles retreated to chambers, still touched by the air, that circulated through all levels of the fortress. The silence of the night only made the hidden truth more noticeable. No matter how powerful the castle seemed, it could not escape the realities created by human life. To understand medieval castles fully is to accept their dual nature. They were strong yet unclean, proud yet decaying, structured yet chaotic. Their legacy is not written only in stone carvings or heroic tales, but in the evidence preserved beneath, behind, and within them. Waste, filth, and human remains form as much a part of their history as battles, coronations, or alliances. The truth is uncomfortable, but it is complete. And when viewed honestly, this truth reveals a world shaped not by glory alone, but by endurance. The final impression left by these fortresses is not the shine of armor or the echo of drums, but the reality that people lived in conditions that challenged them constantly. They adapted, survived, and built lives despite everything surrounding them. Their strength was not found in perfection, but in persistence. And the castles they left behind carry that persistence forward, etched into every stone, every stain, every fossilized fragment that still lies hidden within their architecture. Now, as we step back from these stories and allow the weight of their truth to settle, the castle becomes something different, not a symbol of untouched nobility, but a reminder of how humanity has always lived within the tension between beauty and decay. That tension shaped the medieval world just as it shapes ours today. The fortress stands as a witness, holding both the elegance people wanted others to see and the filth they tried to forget. Tonight, as the thoughts of these hidden truths settle gently like dust, you may feel the quiet heaviness of the past resting close enough to touch. Let that weight dissolve slowly, Let the stones fade back into darkness. Let the castle walls fall silent once more. Rest now. You have walked through shadows long forgotten, and there is peace waiting at the end of this journey. Good night.